I sold my engineering firm for $80 million and decided to celebrate with my daughter and her husband. We booked the most exclusive restaurant in the city. When I stepped away to take a call from my lawyer, a young waiter intercepted me in the dim hallway. He whispered that my daughter had just emptied a capsule of white powder into my wine glass. I walked back to the table, created a quick distraction, and swapped my glass with my son-in-law's. 10 minutes later, their absolute nightmare began. I am Anton, 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire with my bare hands. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that betrayal from your own blood is the ultimate sin. The crystal chandeliers of the restaurant cast a cold, sharp light over our secluded corner table. I had just finalized the sale of my commercial engineering firm for $80 million, a monumental milestone that should have felt like the absolute pinnacle of a lifelong, grueling journey. Instead, sitting across from my daughter Alyssa and her husband Wyatt, the victory tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. Wyatt sat rigidly in his expensive, tailored suit, his pale skin contrasting sharply with the dark velvet upholstery of the booth, offering a plastic, highly practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. Alyssa mirrored his exact expression, her gaze darting nervously to the surrounding tables, the waiters, the menu, anywhere except directly at my face. We were supposed to be celebrating a legacy I built from a rusted, leaking garage into a national enterprise. Naomi, my brilliant and deeply missed late wife, should have been sitting beside me right now, sharing the warmth of this triumph. Without her grounding presence, the expensive vintage champagne and the imported Wagyu steaks felt entirely hollow, a meaningless display of wealth. The tension at the table was a heavy physical weight, thick with unspoken resentments and calculated transactional pleasantries. They raised their crystal flutes, uttering empty congratulations that rang profoundly false against the ambient hum of the dining room. Suddenly, my phone vibrated intensely in my breast pocket. The caller ID showed Oliver, my lead corporate attorney. I excused myself politely, sliding out of the suffocating booth. Wyatt immediately leaned closer to Alyssa the second he thought my back was turned, his voice dropping to an urgent murmur. I navigated through the crowded, opulent dining room, stepping away from the clattering noise and the toxic aura of my own family. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors leading to the private terrace, seeking a quiet, isolated moment to discuss the largest financial transaction of my entire life. The cool night air hit my face, providing a brief, sharp relief from the stifling atmosphere inside the restaurant. Before I could even swipe the screen to answer Oliver's call, a shadow stepped out frantically from the dark alcove near the kitchen service doors. It was Diego, a young, hard-working waiter who had been diligently refilling our water glasses all evening. His dark eyes were wide with genuine, unadulterated terror, his hands trembling visibly as he clutched a silver serving tray tight against his chest. He looked over his shoulder in a panic, ensuring the hallway behind him remained entirely empty before stepping dangerously close to my personal space. He whispered with a frantic, desperate urgency that chilled my blood instantly. Diego confessed that he had been carrying a tray of appetizers past our corner booth the exact moment I turned out of sight. He swore he witnessed Alyssa pull a small, clear capsule from her designer clutch purse, twist it open with practiced speed, and dump a fine white powder directly into my glass of Pinot Noir. He watched her stir the dark red liquid swiftly with her silver butter knife before hiding the empty plastic shell back in her bag. The sheer horror of the revelation hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The primal instinct I had honed over 4 decades of surviving cutthroat corporate battles and racial prejudice in the business world flared to life. You do not build an $80 million company from the ground up without learning exactly how to spot a predator in your proximity. My own daughter had just weaponized my life's greatest celebration. I did not panic, nor did I yell. I reached smoothly into my pocket, handed Diego a crisp $100 bill for his incredible courage, and commanded him to keep completely silent about what he saw. I took a deep, steadying breath of the cold air. My mind shifted instantly from a grieving, disappointed father to a ruthless wartime tactician. I slipped the silent phone back into my tailored jacket pocket without ever answering Oliver and walked purposefully back into the vibrant, noisy main dining room. Every single step I took across the patterned carpet felt perfectly calculated and entirely deliberate. I approached our corner table, maintaining the relaxed, unsuspecting posture of a tired old man returning from a mundane legal phone call. Alyssa sat up noticeably straighter as I arrived, her manicured hands resting innocently on her lap, a picture of perfect, dutiful daughterhood. Wyatt was heavily distracted, busy inspecting his own reflection in the polished blade of his dining knife. I slid back into the deep leather booth. The tainted glass of red wine sat exactly where I had left it, the dark liquid completely still harboring its unseen violence. I reached for my white cloth napkin, intentionally catching the heavy, ornate handle of my silver fork. It clattered loudly against the mahogany table edge and plummeted directly to the hardwood floor, sliding straight toward Wyatt's impeccably polished leather shoes. Wyatt let out a sharp, annoyed sigh and bent down awkwardly under the heavy table to retrieve the silverware. Alyssa immediately rolled her eyes and turned her head away in sheer irritation, looking sharply toward the bustling kitchen doors. Their dual, perfectly timed distraction provided me with exactly 1.5 seconds of entirely unobserved time. My hands moved with the absolute uncompromising precision of a seasoned mechanic. I gripped the delicate stem of my poisoned wine glass and swiftly, flawlessly exchanged it with Wyatt's identical glass sitting mere inches away on the table. I settled back comfortably into my seat just as Wyatt emerged holding the fork, his face flushed red from the physical effort. Alyssa turned back around, her false, beaming smile securely reattached to her face. They had noticed absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The devastating trap they had so carefully set for me was now fully armed and silently waiting for the wrong prey. Wyatt placed the retrieved fork back onto the crisp white tablecloth, dusting off his hands with a look of supreme, unwarranted self-importance. He confidently reached for the glass I had just placed directly in front of him. Alyssa watched his movement intently, then raised her own glass of sparkling mineral water, offering him a subtle, encouraging nod. Wyatt held the tainted wine high in the air, the dark ruby liquid catching the warm, golden light of the extravagant chandelier overhead. He cleared his throat loudly, projecting his voice just enough for the neighboring tables to hear his grandiose performance. He declared an impassioned, utterly fake toast to family unity, to enduring health, and to the brilliant, wealthy future my hard-earned money was undoubtedly going to provide for them. I calmly picked up my newly acquired, perfectly safe glass of wine. I stared dead into Wyatt's pale blue eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to offer even a single shred of paternal warmth. I clinked my fragile glass against his with a sharp, resonant, and final chime. I told him quietly that the future truly belongs only to those who possess the strength to earn it. Wyatt smirked arrogantly, completely blind to the heavy, menacing weight of my words. He brought the crystal rim to his lips and swallowed the tainted wine in 3 large, incredibly greedy gulps. I took a slow, measured sip from my clean glass, my unwavering eyes never leaving his smug face for a fraction of a second. Alyssa smiled widely, a look of twisted, victorious triumph washing over her features, entirely unaware that her husband had just enthusiastically consumed the exact poison meant to destroy my mind and steal my empire. I set my glass down firmly on the table and leaned back deep into the plush leather of my dining chair. The silent, irreversible countdown began ticking in my head. 10 minutes pass in excruciatingly slow motion. The expensive Wagyu steak arrives at our table. Wyatt suddenly stops cutting his meat. A single bead of sweat rolls down his pale temple, catching the chandelier's light. His breathing turns shallow, then frantic. He drops his heavy silver knife, the metal clattering against his porcelain plate. He claws at his custom Italian silk tie, gasping for air as if the room is rapidly shrinking. Alyssa sharply asks what is wrong. Wyatt ignores her entirely. His hands shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He grips the edge of the mahogany table for balance, but ends up yanking the massive floral centerpiece. Crystal vases shatter loudly against the hardwood floor. Ice water and crushed roses spill everywhere. Wyatt stares at his own hands in absolute horror, his pupils dilating until his eyes look entirely black. This is not a slow-acting poison designed to kill. It is a massive dose of a high-grade hallucinogenic neurotoxin. Alyssa intended to trigger a severe, highly visible psychotic break in me tonight. She wanted an audience of wealthy socialites to witness my sudden mental collapse, providing her with undeniable proof for a medical lockdown. Instead, her husband is absorbing the full terrifying impact of her synthetic nightmare. Wyatt groans a guttural sound that draws the attention of every single patron in the exclusive dining room. He stumbles to his feet, kicking his heavy chair backward. Diego the waiter freezes near the kitchen doors, locking eyes with me for a fraction of a second. I give him a subtle nod to stay put. Wyatt tears his collar open, popping the expensive buttons off his dress shirt. He swats blindly at the air, fighting invisible demons manifesting in his altered reality. Alyssa grabs his arm, her carefully maintained facade cracking. Wyatt violently shoves her away. The neurotoxin completely severs the connection between his conscious mind and his suppressed thoughts. The drug bypasses his carefully constructed filter, unlocking the vault of his true nature. Wyatt staggers backward, pointing a trembling accusatory finger directly at my face. The sheer hatred burning in his dilated eyes is palpable and raw. He unleashes a screaming, vile tirade that echoes off the vaulted ceilings of the restaurant. He openly mocks my tailored suit, declaring that putting a tuxedo on a mechanic does not change the grease permanently stained into his skin. His voice reaches a hysterical, mocking pitch as he belittles the 40 years I spent building my engineering firm from a rusted freezing garage on the south side of Chicago. He sneers at my black heritage, spitting out that my $80 million empire is a fluke, an unearned lottery ticket that belongs in the hands of someone truly cultured like him. Alyssa frantically grabs his broad shoulders, begging him to lower his voice and stop talking. Wyatt backhands her grip away with brutal force. He paces around the shattered centerpiece, laughing maniacally at the horrified faces of the wealthy diners surrounding us. He shouts that I am just a stubborn, outdated relic holding on to a fortune I am too stupid to spend properly. He claims my intelligence is a myth, a lucky streak built entirely on the backs of superior men. I sit completely motionless in my chair, sipping my clean water. I let him dig his own grave with a silver spoon. Every venomous word he spews validates my decision to swap those glasses. He is parading his absolute disgust for the man who paid for his luxury car, his penthouse, and the very food he is currently choking on. The other patrons whisper in sheer disgust, some pulling out their smartphones to record the epic meltdown. Wyatt is a wild animal caught firmly in a snare of his wife's making. The hallucinogenic delirium pushes Wyatt over the final edge of sanity. He wildly waves his arms, addressing the entire room of affluent strangers as if delivering a deranged keynote speech. His face is flushed, crimson sweat pouring down his neck and soaking his ruined collar. He screams the ultimate damning secret Alyssa thought they had buried perfectly. He bellows that the old man has not signed the conservatorship papers yet. He beats his chest, declaring that the $80 million is already his, that they have the corrupt doctors lined up and the fake diagnosis ready to go. He laughs a terrifying, unhinged laugh, bragging that I will be locked inside a psychiatric ward by midnight while he redecorates my estate. The entire dining room falls dead silent. The clinking of silverware and the soft jazz music seem to evaporate completely. Waiters stop mid-step with trays balanced on their shoulders. The restaurant manager freezes by the host stand with a phone pressed to his ear. Wyatt just publicly confessed to a premeditated conspiracy to commit elder abuse, medical fraud, and grand theft completely unprompted. He dances around the broken glass, chanting about his upcoming Cayman Islands accounts and how incredibly easy it was to fool the senile old fool. I look directly at Alyssa. The color completely drains from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. Her brilliant, foolproof plan to humiliate me and steal my life's work has spectacularly backfired in the most public forum possible. She is no longer looking at a compliant, confused father. She is staring at the total destruction of her future broadcasted live to the city's elite. Her husband is literally shouting their criminal manifesto at the top of his lungs. Alyssa realizes the catastrophic damage unfolding before her eyes. Absolute panic takes over her body. She lunges across the ruined table, grabbing Wyatt by his torn collar with both hands. She slaps him across the face with all the frantic strength she can muster. The sharp, cracking sound of her palm striking his cheek breaks the heavy silence of the dining room. Wyatt stumbles backward, completely disoriented, as a thick stream of dark blood begins dripping from his busted lower lip onto his crisp white shirt. He looks at her with wide, terrified eyes, entirely lost in his chemically induced nightmare. Just as Alyssa raises her hand to strike him again, the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant burst open. 3 paramedics rush in with a gurney summoned by the manager's emergency call. They tackle Wyatt to the floor as he thrashes wildly, screaming about spiders and stolen millions. The medics quickly strap his arms and legs down with heavy leather belts, injecting a powerful sedative into his thigh to stop the violent convulsions. Alyssa trails behind them, weeping hysterically, attempting to play the role of the devastated wife dealing with a sudden medical emergency. Her theatrical performance is utterly useless. Everyone in the room heard the unvarnished truth. I remain seated in my booth, perfectly calm as I watch the paramedics wheel my treacherous son-in-law out into the flashing red lights of the ambulance. I carefully fold my cloth napkin and place it on the table. The immediate threat is neutralized, but the war is far from over. I stand up, adjust my suit jacket, and walk out of the restaurant through the side exit. I must reach my home before Alyssa has a chance to destroy the physical evidence of their conspiracy. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room hummed with a sterile clinical energy that starkly contrasted the chaos we had just left behind. I followed the paramedics through the swinging double doors, keeping a calculated distance. Alyssa trailed right beside the stretcher, clutching Wyatt's limp hand tightly. The heavy sedatives had reduced my son-in-law from a raving, hateful lunatic to a sweating, unconscious husk. The attending physician, a stern woman in green scrubs, intercepted us before we could reach the trauma bay. She pulled Alyssa aside, but I positioned myself close enough to hear every single syllable. The doctor's expression carried no sympathy, only professional urgency. She stated clearly that Wyatt was not suffering from an allergic reaction or standard food poisoning. The toxicology screen had returned immediate and highly disturbing results. Wyatt was experiencing a massive overdose of a powerful, illegal synthetic hallucinogen. The doctor explained that this specific neurotoxin was engineered to forcefully detach the brain's frontal lobe functions, inducing violent psychosis, severe paranoia, and total loss of behavioral control. The dosage in his bloodstream was lethal enough to cause permanent neurological damage if they had not intervened with heavy tranquilizers. Hearing the clinical description of the poison sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. The precision of the chemical agent proved this was not a desperate, impulsive act. It was a sophisticated, highly expensive assassination of the mind. Alyssa had acquired a weapon designed to meticulously dismantle human sanity. I watched the doctor directly ask Alyssa if her husband had a history of abusing designer narcotics. The question hung heavily in the cold hospital air, setting the perfect stage for my daughter's next calculated performance. Alyssa did not miss a single beat. She immediately weaponized her grief, transforming into the flawless picture of a traumatized, heartbroken wife. Real tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She let out a piercing theatrical sob that echoed down the sterile hospital corridor, grabbing the immediate attention of passing nurses and security guards. She grabbed the front of the doctor's scrubs, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. She shrieked that Wyatt was a respected businessman who never touched drugs. She pointed her finger wildly, blaming the luxury restaurant for intentionally tampering with his food or drink. She threatened to sue the establishment, the chefs, and the entire medical staff if they dared to suggest her husband was a junkie. It was a flawless, terrifying performance. Her indignation was so authentic, so incredibly loud that the attending physician actually took a step back, raising her hands in a placating gesture. I stood there, an unmoving shadow against the stark white wall, observing the exact monster I had raised. She was actively building an ironclad alibi in real time. By shifting the blame to the restaurant, she was entirely removing herself from any suspicion. She demanded the police be called to investigate the kitchen staff, screaming that someone had maliciously targeted her family. Her frantic energy filled the room, forcing the medical personnel to focus on calming her down rather than asking further logical questions. She was controlling the narrative with absolute ruthlessness. The realization of her sheer deceptive capacity solidified my resolve. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation evaporated right then and there. I was no longer dealing with a misguided child. I was in a room with a remorseless predator actively covering her tracks. I remained perfectly still in the cold corner of the emergency room, letting the chaotic scene wash over me without reacting. As Alyssa continued her hysterical performance for the nurses, the puzzle pieces rapidly snapped together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The synthetic hallucinogen was never meant for Wyatt. That specific mind-shattering dose was calibrated exactly for a 70-year-old man. The timeline of the evening was completely premeditated. We were out celebrating the $80 million sale of my engineering firm at a highly public, crowded venue. If I had consumed that tainted wine, the violent, screaming psychosis Wyatt just experienced would have been mine. I would have torn at my clothes, smashed tables, and raved like a lunatic in front of dozens of wealthy socialites and city elites. The police and paramedics would have been called for an insane, out-of-control elderly man. By midnight, I would have been strapped to a gurney and involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward. Alyssa and Wyatt needed a catastrophic, heavily documented public breakdown to instantly legitimize their emergency petition for conservatorship. A medical lockdown would grant them immediate, uncontested authority over my legal affairs, my estate, and the $80 million currently sitting in escrow. They had orchestrated my social and mental execution down to the absolute minute. The sheer scale of the betrayal threatened to suffocate me, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and steady. My survival depended on absolute discipline. The poison had failed to hit its target, but the legal machinery they set in motion was still actively threatening my freedom. I needed to act immediately before Alyssa realized the depth of my awareness. The battlefield was shifting from the hospital back to my home. Alyssa finally collapsed into a plastic waiting room chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with fake sobs. A sympathetic nurse rushed over with a cup of water and a warm blanket. I stepped out of the shadows and approached her, slowly projecting the image of a weary, concerned father, overwhelmed by the night's tragic events. I placed a heavy hand gently on her shoulder. She flinched slightly, but quickly leaned into the touch, seeking comfort from the man she had just tried to chemically lobotomize. I kept my voice soft, laced with gravel and fake exhaustion. I told her I could not bear to see Wyatt in this condition and needed a moment to clear my head. I told her I was going down to the hospital cafeteria to get us both some strong coffee and gather my thoughts. She nodded without looking up, waving me away dismissively as she continued her weeping charade. I turned and walked slowly down the bright corridor until I rounded the corner. The instant I was out of her line of sight, my posture straightened. The tired old man vanished completely. I bypassed the cafeteria entirely and walked straight out the sliding glass doors into the freezing night air. I retrieved my keys, unlocked my car, and slid behind the wheel. I started the engine, my mind racing with cold, tactical precision. Alyssa would soon realize the gravity of Wyatt's public confession at the restaurant. She would inevitably panic and send someone to purge my private study of the forged legal documents. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt. I had to reach my estate and secure my home office before she destroyed the evidence. My tires crunched heavily against the wet gravel as I pulled into the sweeping, circular driveway of my estate. I killed the engine and slipped out of the vehicle with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to moving through hostile environments. The sprawling property was draped in heavy shadows, silent except for the rhythmic drumming of the freezing rain against the stone pillars. I unlocked the main entrance, immediately sensing an unnatural disturbance in the quiet foyer. The air felt disturbed, thick with the lingering energy of a recent intrusion. I moved silently down the long, unlit corridor toward my private study. The heavy oak door, which I explicitly lock every single morning without fail, stood slightly ajar. A thin sliver of moonlight cut across the imported Persian rug, illuminating the absolute violation of my sanctuary. I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The room had been subjected to a frantic, careless search. Heavy reference books were shoved out of alignment on the mahogany shelves. My leather reading chair was pushed back aggressively against the wall, scraping the hardwood. Several filing drawers hung open, exposing loose folders and disorganized binders. Alyssa and Wyatt did not just plan to drug me tonight. They used the hours before the celebratory dinner to scavenge through my most private space, hunting for leverage. I set my jaw, refusing to turn on the main chandelier. I used the ambient light from the large bay window to assess the damage. My mind processed the scene not with panic, but with a cold, calculating precision. They were looking for something highly specific. They needed paperwork or control before triggering my public breakdown at the restaurant. I walked directly toward the eastern wall of the room. The true target of their desperate search remained hidden behind a specific piece of art. I stood before the large oil portrait of Naomi. Her painted eyes offered a silent, steadfast comfort in the dark, chaotic room. I reached out and gently swung the heavy frame outward on its concealed brass hinges. Behind her smiling face rested a reinforced steel wall safe. I built this vault with my own welding tools 30 years ago, back when my engineering firm was nothing but a cramped, poorly ventilated garage on the south side of Chicago. I trusted cold steel and fire long before I learned to trust corporate banks or smiling financial advisors. I ran my calloused fingers over the biometric scanner. Fresh, jagged scratch marks gouged the thick metal casing surrounding the lock mechanism. Someone took a flathead screwdriver or a heavy steel chisel to the panel, desperately trying to pry off the electronic interface. Wyatt. The arrogant fool actually believed brute physical force could compromise a custom vault designed by a master structural engineer. He must have spent an hour sweating in this room before our dinner, hacking away at the solid steel, completely failing to breach the mechanism. The realization hardened my resolve into something unbreakable. Wyatt lacks patience and intellect. He relies entirely on aggression and entitlement. The failed break-in revealed the sheer urgency of their timeline. They needed access to my original estate planning documents tonight. Since they failed to breach the vault, they had to rely entirely on whatever loose paperwork they could find scattered across the room. I turned my attention to my massive executive desk. A pile of seemingly mundane tax documents sat suspiciously disorganized near my brass reading lamp. I moved toward the desk, knowing that whatever they left behind would expose the exact parameters of their conspiracy. I clicked on the small brass reading lamp, throwing a sharp beam of light across the chaotic desk surface. I carefully shifted a stack of quarterly tax returns aside. Underneath the decoy folders lay a thick, stapled packet of legal documents bearing the embossed letterhead of a notorious downtown law firm. The first page was a heavily redacted draft. I picked it up, scanning the dense legal jargon with eyes trained to read complex structural blueprints. It was a formal petition for full conservatorship. Alyssa was listed explicitly as the sole petitioner. My name sat starkly under the designation of the incapacitated ward. The bold text cited a rapid cognitive decline, severe dementia, and sudden violent outbursts. The printed words hit me with the force of a physical strike. They had already constructed an entire fictitious medical history for me. The narrative was meticulously crafted to justify stripping away every single one of my human rights. They planned to present me to a judge as an unstable, aggressive burden who could no longer manage a vast financial empire. Wyatt's public meltdown at the restaurant was supposed to be my meltdown. The poisoned wine was engineered to provide the final indisputable layer of proof for this exact legal filing. They intended to legally erase me from my own life, seizing immediate, uncontested control over the $80 million currently waiting in the escrow account. They had dug a grave for my mind, completely ready to push me in and bury me alive. I held the damning document tightly, the thick paper crinkling under my intense grip. I finally possessed the absolute proof of their treason written in plain ink. The sudden sharp vibration of my phone in the silent study jolted me from the legal paperwork. I pulled the device from my jacket pocket. The bright screen displayed an incoming call from Oliver. My lead corporate attorney never calls this late unless a financial structure is actively collapsing. I swiped to answer, skipping any formal greeting. Oliver bypassed pleasantries entirely. His voice was tight with pure professional alarm. He informed me that an automated security alert just triggered through the county registry system regarding my primary residence. I stood completely still, the air in the study suddenly feeling thin and icy. Oliver stated the facts clearly and without hesitation. Someone successfully executed a massive second mortgage on my estate exactly 3 months ago. $500,000 in equity was liquidated and wired out of the property under my name. I stared at the scratched biometric lock on the wall safe, the puzzle expanding into an entirely new dimension of fraud. The poison tonight was a desperate attempt to cover up a catastrophic theft that had already happened. They did not just want the $80 million from the company sale. They had already started butchering my personal assets right beneath my nose months before the restaurant dinner was ever planned. The phone remained pressed to my ear as the sheer magnitude of the infiltration took hold. I instructed Oliver to immediately pull the signature records for the loan and lock down the registry. The battle was no longer just about protecting my future fortune. It was about hunting down the traitors who had already plundered my home. The sharp morning sun breached the floor-to-ceiling windows of Oliver's downtown law office, casting long, harsh shadows across the polished mahogany desk. I sat entirely rigid in the leather guest chair, the lingering adrenaline from last night's midnight race to my estate still vibrating in my jaw. I had successfully secured my original estate planning documents and locked down my property before Alyssa could deploy her scavengers to finish their search. Now the true scope of the financial hemorrhage needed to be explicitly quantified. Oliver did not offer a comforting greeting or pour a cup of coffee. He simply opened a thick manila folder and slid a single heavily stamped bank statement across the glass surface. The black ink on the page detailed a catastrophic breach of my personal assets. 3 months ago, while I was undergoing a routine surgery for a minor heart murmur, my sprawling 70-acre estate was quietly leveraged for a $500,000 cash loan. The sheer audacity of the maneuver struck me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The property was fully paid off decades ago, a sanctuary I built specifically to ensure my late wife, Naomi, never had to worry about a mortgage payment again. The bank had approved the massive equity withdrawal without ever speaking to me directly. Oliver tapped his silver pen against the bottom right corner of the document, his face etched with grim professional concern. The automated security alert he received last night was just the final trigger of a deeply embedded bureaucratic time bomb. My own daughter had effectively turned my home into a private automated teller machine, extracting $500,000 while I was lying sedated and vulnerable in a hospital recovery room. I leaned forward and scrutinized the final page of the heavy loan agreement. The signature authorizing the massive financial lien stared back at me in crisp blue ink. It was an absolute masterpiece of deception. The sweeping loops and harsh, deliberate angles perfectly mimicked the distinct, heavy-handed scrawl I had used to sign thousands of engineering blueprints over the last 40 years. A casual observer or a standard bank clerk processing a stack of paperwork would never question its authenticity. But I knew my own hand intimately. The pen pressure on the page was far too even, lacking the slight involuntary hesitation I always exhibited at the end of the letter and due to an old welding injury. Alyssa had studied my handwriting for years, practicing relentlessly until she could replicate the exact mechanical strokes of my legal identity. She weaponized her position as my only child, striding confidently into the national bank branch, where she was a familiar, entirely trusted face. Oliver pulled up a secondary digital file on his monitor, revealing the official notarization stamp that accompanied the forged signature. The seal belonged to a local notary public who had previously worked for Wyatt's failing real estate firm. Alyssa had completely bypassed the strict mandatory in-person security protocols by utilizing a corrupt official who was perfectly willing to rubber stamp a fraudulent document for the right price. They had circumvented the impenetrable corporate firewalls I had spent millions building simply by attacking the vulnerable human element at the local branch level. My own flesh and blood had orchestrated a legally binding identity theft with terrifying clinical precision. I placed the forged contract back onto the glass desk, flattening it out with a slow, deliberate sweep of my palm. The immediate pressing question was the final destination of the stolen funds. Alyssa's boutique marketing agency had been bleeding cash for 2 years, and I initially assumed she had siphoned the $500,000 to aggressively cover her failing payroll and maintain her lavish lifestyle. Oliver turned his monitor toward me, shaking his head with a look of profound disgust. He had spent the early hours of the morning deploying a team of forensic accountants to rigorously trace the digital footprint of the massive wire transfer. The money never touched Alyssa's business accounts. It never even entered a domestic bank within the United States. The entire sum was rapidly routed through 3 different holding companies before vanishing entirely across international borders. Oliver pointed a stern finger to a highlighted string of IP addresses and complex routing numbers. The $500,000 landed cleanly into a heavily encrypted offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The corporate registration documents for that specific offshore account carried only one name. It was not Alyssa. The account was held exclusively by Wyatt. My daughter had committed a massive felony, risked federal prison for wire fraud, and actively attempted to poison her own father, all to secure a fortune that her husband immediately hoarded entirely for himself. She had blindly handed him the keys to his own untraceable financial escape vehicle. Wyatt was never planning to share the spoils of my $80 million buyout. He was actively bleeding my estate dry to build a private war chest, positioning himself to abandon Alyssa the very second the money was fully secured. She was nothing but a gullible accomplice, an expendable pawn in his long-term exit strategy. I gathered the dense forensic reports into my leather briefcase and instructed Oliver to immediately initiate the extreme legal protocols required to challenge the fraudulent mortgage. I needed to freeze all domestic accounts connected to my name before Wyatt could drain anything else from a distance. I left the towering glass office building and drove back to my estate, my mind violently processing the intricate multi-layered betrayal. The heavy rain from the previous night had completely cleared, leaving the sprawling grounds of my property washed in harsh, revealing afternoon sunlight. As I turned my vehicle up the long, winding gravel driveway, I slammed on the brakes. The heavy iron security gates were wide open, the digital access keypad completely smashed and sparking wires. 2 massive, heavily muscled men in cheap, poorly fitting suits were leaning casually against the polished hood of my prized vintage Mustang parked near the front steps. They did not wear the crisp, identifiable uniforms of private security or the recognizable professional attire of bank repossession agents. Their demeanor was openly hostile, their thick bodies carrying the distinct heavy tension of impending violence. I killed the engine and stepped out of my car, my boots crunching loudly on the driveway gravel. The taller of the two men pushed himself off the pristine paint of my classic car, a cruel, predatory smirk pulling at his scarred face. He did not ask for my identity. He knew exactly whose property he was trespassing on. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his dark jacket, his eyes locked onto mine with absolute, unwavering malice. These men were not sent by the bank to collect on the forged $500,000 mortgage. They were violent debt collectors from the criminal underworld, and they had come directly to the source to collect exactly what they were owed. I did not flinch. Decades spent navigating the brutal, uncompromising world of commercial engineering had taught me that showing fear to a predator was a fatal error. I slammed my car door shut, the heavy metallic thud echoing across the wet gravel of the driveway, and walked directly toward the two massive figures leaning against the hood of my pristine vintage Mustang. Their cheap, poorly tailored suits strained against their heavily muscled frames, radiating a distinct aggressive energy that belonged in back-alley brawls rather than my manicured estate. The taller of the two men pushed himself off the classic car, his heavy boots crunching menacingly on the crushed stone. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, predatory strides. He did not ask for my name or offer any form of greeting. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his dark rain-dampened jacket and pulled out a sharply folded, violently crumpled piece of paper. With a swift, brutal motion, he shoved the document directly into the center of my chest. I caught the paper before it fell to the ground, my eyes locked dead onto his scarred face. I unfolded the heavy parchment, slowly refusing to break eye contact until the very last second. The document was a crude, handwritten promissory note demanding an exorbitant sum of cash. At the bottom of the page, where a standard signature should have been, rested a dark, unmistakable mark. It was a perfectly clear, rust-colored impression of a human thumbprint stamped aggressively in dried blood. The thumbprint belonged to Wyatt. The men standing in my driveway were not here to serve banking documents or discuss foreclosure proceedings. They were the violent enforcers of an illicit underworld, and my son-in-law had directed them straight to my front door. I smoothly slid my left hand into my tailored suit jacket, my thumb finding the small tactile switch of the digital audio recorder I always carried for high-stakes corporate negotiations. I pressed the button, feeling the familiar reassuring double vibration that confirmed the device was actively capturing every single sound in the immediate vicinity. I lowered the bloody promissory note and squared my shoulders, addressing the towering enforcers with a voice completely devoid of panic. I informed them in a cold, measured tone that they were currently trespassing on a private 70-acre estate backed by a highly sophisticated armed security network. I stated clearly that the perimeter sensors had already logged their vehicle and that private tactical response units would arrive at this exact location within 90 seconds. The taller man scoffed, crossing his massive arms over his chest, but a brief, undeniable flash of hesitation crossed his dark eyes. I capitalized on that microscopic fracture in his confidence immediately. I offered them a single, non-negotiable ultimatum. They could either provide me with the absolute unvarnished truth behind Wyatt's bloody thumbprint right now, or they could test their luck against the tactical security team rapidly converging on the driveway. I guaranteed them safe, unhindered passage off my property solely in exchange for the exact operational details of my son-in-law's debt. The second enforcer, a stocky man with a broken nose, shifted his weight, nervously glancing back toward the heavy iron gates they had compromised to enter my sanctuary. They were brutes accustomed to intimidating, terrified, indebted gamblers in dark alleyways, not facing down a 70-year-old corporate titan standing firmly on his own heavily fortified ground. The shift in power was instantaneous and palpable. The lead collector uncrossed his arms and spat on the wet gravel. The lead collector sneered, revealing a row of yellowed, crooked teeth that perfectly matched the ugly reality of his profession. He realized the inherent danger of his current position and decided the information was worth his immediate freedom. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the bloody fingerprint marking the crude promissory note in my hand. He revealed with brutal, unfiltered honesty that Wyatt was a degenerate, out-of-control gambler who had successfully burned through every single line of credit the legitimate banking world had to offer. When the banks finally locked him out, Wyatt turned to their illicit syndicate, borrowing massive sums of illicit cash to chase catastrophic losses at underground high-stakes tables. The stocky man with the broken nose chimed in his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He stated clearly that Wyatt currently owed their employers nearly $1 million in principal and aggressively compounding interest. They had grown entirely tired of his endless, pathetic excuses and cornered him in a parking garage 3 days ago, extracting the bloody thumbprint as a final physical guarantee of payment. The lead collector let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through the cold night air. He explained that Wyatt had begged for his life on his knees, offering a desperate, highly specific guarantee to stay their violent hands. Wyatt promised to pay the ruthless syndicate back triple the total amount he owed on the exact specific day his rich old father-in-law finally unloaded his commercial engineering company. The violent enforcers were simply here to collect the massive premium Wyatt had explicitly promised them. They had tracked my financial movements and knew the corporate sale finalized tonight. Wyatt had actively leveraged the potential sale of my life's work as a shield to protect his own pathetic life. The devastating truth settled into my bones with absolute chilling clarity. The highly confidential $80 million sale of my engineering firm was never a secret to Wyatt. He had actively monitored my corporate maneuvers for months, eagerly anticipating the date the monumental transaction would clear. My financial victory was entirely designated as the massive life-saving payout for his catastrophic survival in the criminal underworld. The fraudulent $500,000 mortgage on my estate was merely a desperate stopgap measure to keep these violent enforcers at bay while he waited for the corporate buyout to finalize. Tonight was the culmination of his desperate survival strategy. He needed me legally incapacitated and stripped of my mental faculties right as the $80 million hit the escrow account so he could instantly siphon the funds to erase his life-threatening debts. I pocketed the bloody promissory note and stepped aside, honoring my strict ultimatum. I ordered the two enforcers to get off my property immediately and never return, assuring them their employer would receive his money through the ensuing legal decimation of my son-in-law. The men did not argue. They climbed swiftly into their unmarked sedan and sped down the long driveway, vanishing into the dark night. I stood alone in the absolute silence of my estate, the entire criminal conspiracy now fully illuminated in my mind. I had the forged loan documents and the bloody confession of his illicit debts. But I needed the absolute, undeniable proof of the attempted assassination to permanently annihilate them both. I turned around, walked briskly back to my vehicle, and slid behind the leather steering wheel. I fired up the powerful engine, throwing the car violently into reverse. I had to drive straight back to the luxury restaurant. I needed to secure the final piece of the puzzle from Diego. I pushed my vintage Mustang to its absolute limit, tearing back through the rain-slicked city streets toward the luxury restaurant. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police cruisers had long since departed, leaving the opulent building looking deceptively calm. I parked 2 blocks away to avoid any lingering valet staff or curious onlookers. I walked briskly through the cold night air, navigating my way into the narrow, dimly lit alleyway behind the restaurant's massive industrial kitchens. The heavy steel door propped open slightly, spilling a wedge of harsh fluorescent light and the loud clatter of dishwashers onto the wet asphalt. Diego stood shivering near the overflowing commercial dumpsters, pulling his thin waiter's jacket tight across his chest. He jumped when my boots crunched against the loose gravel, his wide eyes scanning the dark perimeter like a trapped animal. He looked entirely exhausted, stripped of the professional composure he had maintained in the dining room. I stepped into the light, keeping my hands visible and my voice entirely level. Diego immediately began speaking in a rushed, frantic whisper. He confessed that the restaurant manager was currently interrogating the entire staff in the main office, threatening immediate termination for anyone who spoke to the press or the authorities about Wyatt's spectacular public breakdown. The management desperately wanted to sweep the catastrophic scandal under the rug to protect their elite reputation. Diego was a college student carrying crippling debt, and losing his premier waiting job meant facing immediate eviction. He looked at me with raw desperation, caught completely between his conscience and his basic survival. I listened to his terrified rambling without interrupting, allowing him to expel the nervous energy before I changed the entire trajectory of his life. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket, my hand brushing past the audio recorder that held the thug's confession. I pulled out my leather-bound checkbook and a heavy gold pen. I moved closer to the flickering amber light of the alleyway security lamp, using the flat, cold surface of an industrial electrical box as my desk. Diego stopped talking entirely, watching my hands with intense, confused hesitation. I asked him a single question regarding his university tuition, forcing him to state the exact numerical figure required to graduate without debt. He stammered, throwing out a substantial number that clearly haunted his daily existence. I did not blink. I wrote out a personal check for that exact amount multiplied by 4 to cover any living expenses, textbooks, and future inflation. I signed the bottom line with the crisp, authentic signature my daughter had so arrogantly forged earlier that day. I tore the heavy slip of paper from the binding and held it out into the damp night air. Diego stared at the incredible sum of money, completely paralyzed. I told him this check cleared his entire academic future, severing his absolute dependence on this toxic restaurant job and the abusive manager currently threatening his livelihood inside. I made my condition flawlessly clear. This financial liberation required zero loyalty to the restaurant, zero protection for my daughter, and zero hesitation. I demanded the absolute, undeniable truth regarding the poison backed by whatever physical proof he possessed. He slowly reached out his trembling fingers, closing around the edge of the paper. He looked from the staggering number written in black ink directly into my eyes, finding only cold, unwavering resolve. The fear evaporated from his posture, replaced instantly by the firm courage of a free man. Diego carefully folded the heavy check and secured it deep inside his breast pocket. He did not waste another second. He reached into his dark trousers and pulled out his personal smartphone, his hands entirely steady now. He swiped across the illuminated glass screen, opening a hidden gallery file before turning the device toward me. I stepped closer, blocking the glare of the overhead security lamp to view the digital recording. The footage was completely devastating in its pristine clarity. Diego explained that the restaurant's strict no-phone policy forced the waitstaff to hide their devices in the decorative floral arrangements at the secondary server station. He had accidentally left his camera recording after snapping a picture of the dessert menu for a friend. The high-definition lens was pointed directly at my secluded corner booth. I watched a silent digital version of myself stand up and walk out of the frame to answer Oliver's crucial phone call. The very second I vanished from the screen, Alyssa moved with terrifying practice speed. The camera captured every single damning detail. I watched my own flesh and blood reach into her designer clutch, pull out the clear synthetic capsule, and aggressively twist it apart. I witnessed the fine white hallucinogenic powder cascade down into my deep glass of red wine. I saw the flash of her silver butter knife as she stirred the poison rapidly into the alcohol, dissolving the lethal evidence before casually dropping the empty plastic shell back into her purse. Her face on the screen carried no guilt, no hesitation, and absolutely no remorse. She looked entirely bored, executing a chemical assassination with the casual indifference of a woman swiping a fly off her table. The visual confirmation settled into my chest like frozen lead. I instructed Diego to immediately transfer the original uncompressed video file directly to my secure server. I watched the progress bar inch across the glowing screen until the definitive chime confirmed the digital transaction was complete. The most dangerous weapon in Alyssa's entire arsenal now belonged entirely to me. Diego locked his phone and looked at me with a quiet, respectful intensity. He asked if I wanted him to call the local police precinct and provide a formal witness statement to the authorities. He offered to walk straight back into the restaurant and hand his phone over to the detectives. I looked at the young man silently, thanking him for his unwavering integrity, but I firmly shook my head. I told him to go back inside, finish his shift quietly, hand in his resignation tomorrow morning, and walk away to build a brilliant future. I explained that dialing emergency services and handing my daughter over to the criminal justice system was far too quick, too clinical, and entirely insufficient. A sudden arrest would only trigger Wyatt's legal defense team, tying the betrayal up in endless court dates and sterile judicial proceedings. Prison was an escape I absolutely refused to grant them. They had actively attempted to obliterate my mind, steal my life's work, and strip away my basic human dignity. They believed their superior intellect and sheer arrogance made them untouchable. I wanted to dismantle that arrogance systematically, brick by brick, until they were left standing in the total ruin of their own greed. I secured my phone in my jacket pocket, turned my back on the harsh light of the alleyway, and walked into the darkness. The long, brutal game of absolute retribution had officially begun. The morning news cycle carried absolutely no mention of the dramatic, violent scene at the luxury restaurant. Wyatt was quietly discharged from the emergency room shortly after dawn, his official medical chart citing a severe case of acute food poisoning. They possessed enough wealth and social influence to effectively seal the hospital records and silence the attending staff. Alyssa was wasting absolutely no time. Her primary assassination attempt had failed, and she desperately needed a new angle to execute the conservatorship before the corporate funds settled. The very next afternoon, my heavy oak front door chimed loudly. I opened it to find my daughter standing on the porch, wrapped tightly in a cashmere coat against the autumn chill. She carried a large insulated container of homemade chicken soup in one hand and a thick manila folder in the other. Her face was a perfect chilling mask of dutiful concern, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. She stepped into the foyer without waiting for an invitation, setting the soup on the console table and remarking on how the restaurant incident must have shaken my nerves. I watched her seamlessly transition into the role of the devoted caretaker. She claimed Wyatt was resting comfortably at their penthouse, traumatized by a bad batch of imported shellfish. Her voice was smooth and perfectly pitched, offering zero indication that she had deliberately attempted to scramble my neurological pathways less than 48 hours ago. She guided me toward the kitchen island, pulling out one of the high-backed wooden stools and insisting I sit down to rest my weary legs. She placed the manila folder deliberately on the cold granite countertop, referring to it casually as a final stack of tedious tax forms required to officially close the company buyout. I leaned heavily against the edge of the kitchen island, deliberately shuffling my feet against the polished tile floor to mimic the physical decline she expected to see. I allowed a highly visible rhythmic tremor to travel down through my right hand as I reached for the edge of the countertop. I rubbed my temples, complaining softly about a severe, lingering headache and a sudden inability to remember the exact sequence of events from our celebration dinner. Alyssa ate up the performance instantly. Her rigid posture relaxed, a fleeting look of supreme confidence washing over her sharp features as she witnessed my supposed physical and cognitive deterioration. She genuinely believed the intense stress of Wyatt's medical emergency had finally triggered the dementia she so desperately needed me to exhibit. I sat down heavily on the stool, letting out a long, ragged sigh that sounded like absolute defeat. I reached up with a trembling finger and tapped the thick black frame of my reading glasses, feigning a clumsy adjustment to the lenses. The simple, innocuous motion activated a state-of-the-art digital microcamera embedded directly inside the bridge of the frames. The tiny red indicator light, entirely invisible to the naked eye, flashed silently to confirm it was recording in high-definition video and audio. Every single movement she made, every lie she spoke, and every document she presented was now being transmitted directly to a secure encrypted cloud server actively monitored by Oliver. I asked her to pour me a cup of hot tea to soothe my throat before I attempted to review the complex paperwork. She eagerly turned her back, moving swiftly toward the stainless steel kettle resting on the stove. I watched her shoulders drop, her entire body language radiating the sheer arrogance of a predator who believes the trap has finally snapped shut. Alyssa placed a steaming porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea directly in front of me, her fake dutiful smile widening across her face. She slid the thick manila folder across the cold granite countertop, pushing a heavy gold fountain pen toward my supposedly trembling hand. She spoke in a soothing, hypnotic cadence, urging me to just sign the bottom lines so she could handle the exhausting bureaucratic burden on my behalf. She claimed the documents were standard federal tax disclosures designed specifically to protect my new wealth from government overreach. I slid my reading glasses down the bridge of my nose, adjusting the hidden microcamera to capture the entire span of the paperwork. I flipped past the generic cover letter and focused my sharp eyes on the dense, meticulously formatted legal print hiding on the third page. It had absolutely nothing to do with corporate taxes or federal revenue codes. It was a binding, irrevocable financial mandate. The clauses were written with absolute cutthroat precision by a team of highly paid corporate vultures. By signing the bottom line, I would legally grant Alyssa unrestricted unilateral authority over the entire $80 million holding account. The document systematically stripped away all my personal banking privileges, granting her the supreme legal power to wire funds, liquidate assets, and transfer the company's sale proceeds directly into the offshore Cayman Islands shell account Wyatt had already established. If I signed this paper, my life's work would vanish into the international banking ether within 60 seconds. She stood hovering over my shoulder, tapping her manicured fingernails impatiently against the granite counter, completely unaware that I possessed the structural engineering intellect to dissect complex legal jargon faster than her crooked lawyers could draft it. I gripped the gold pen tightly, suspending the metal nib a fraction of an inch above the signature line. I let the heavy gold pen drop from my fingers. The metal clattered loudly against the granite island, echoing sharply in the quiet kitchen and breaking the suffocating tension. I rubbed my eyes, letting out a prolonged, raspy groan. I told Alyssa that the fine print was giving me a terrible migraine and that I could not possibly read the dense legal text under the harsh overhead kitchen lights. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the counter for fake physical support. I informed her that I needed to fetch the specialized brass reading lamp from my private study down the hall before I could comfortably sign my name to anything of this magnitude. Alyssa's jaw tightened in sheer frustration, a flash of genuine anger crossing her eyes, but she quickly forced a sickeningly sweet tone, urging me to take my time and drink my tea while it was still hot. I nodded weakly and shuffled out of the kitchen, dragging my feet noisily against the floorboards. As I crossed the threshold into the main corridor, I did not head toward the study. I stopped dead in my tracks and shifted my gaze to the large antique silver mirror hanging directly on the hallway wall. The angled glass provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the kitchen island behind me. I watched Alyssa's reflection with absolute terrifying clarity. The instant she believed I was gone, her sweet facade evaporated into pure malice. She moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency. She reached quickly into the deep pocket of her cashmere coat and pulled out a small, foil-backed blister pack. She snapped a small white pill into her palm and dropped it directly into my steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. The deadly cycle was repeating itself right inside my own home. I gripped the heavy brass stem of the reading lamp from my study, the cool metal grounding my surging adrenaline. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, forcing my shoulders to slump back into the defeated posture of a broken old man, and shuffled slowly back down the long corridor. When I re-entered the bright kitchen, Alyssa was leaning casually against the edge of the granite island. She had completely smoothed over her features, replacing the cold malice I had just witnessed in the hallway mirror, with a warm, sickeningly sweet smile of manufactured concern. The steaming porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea sat waiting precisely where I had left it, next to the thick stack of fraudulent financial mandates. She gestured toward the cup with a delicate wave of her hand, urging me to drink the tea while it was still hot to help soothe my terrible headache. I placed the brass lamp onto the counter with a heavy, clumsy thud, maintaining the facade of a man struggling with basic motor functions. I reached out with a deliberately trembling hand, allowing my fingers to hover over the delicate handle of the teacup. Alyssa's eyes tracked my every movement with absolute unblinking intensity. The sheer anticipation radiating from her rigid posture was palpable, a predator watching its prey step willingly into a steel trap. The faint floral aroma of the bergamot tea completely masked the chemical taint of the synthetic hallucinogen she had just deposited into the dark liquid. She genuinely believed her meticulous performance had secured her ultimate victory. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain, lifting the cup slowly from its matching saucer. She leaned forward ever so slightly, her fake smile widening into a rigid grimace of impending triumph as the rim of the cup approached my face. Instead of bringing the tainted liquid to my lips, I tightened my grip around the porcelain and pivoted my entire body with a sudden, explosive surge of kinetic energy. I violently hurled the scalding tea directly downward onto the expensive hardwood floor. The delicate cup impacted the solid oak planks with the devastating force of a gunshot. The porcelain shattered instantly into 100 jagged flying pieces, sending a massive spray of boiling dark liquid across the polished wood and splashing violently against the pristine white baseboards. The sharp, explosive crack of the impact completely shattered the suffocating artificial silence of the kitchen. I dropped the trembling old man routine instantly. My spine snapped perfectly straight, my shoulders squaring as the raw, unbridled authority I commanded in corporate boardrooms flooded back into my posture. The dark tea pooled rapidly on the floor, the synthetic poison dissolving uselessly into the expanding puddle at our feet. The sudden, violent destruction of the cup severed the meticulously crafted illusion Alyssa had built. The noise echoed down the high ceilings of the estate, leaving a ringing void in its wake. I stood completely still, staring down at the ruined porcelain scattered across the floor, feeling the absolute liberation of dropping my compliance. The physical act of smashing her poisoned offering was a definitive declaration of war. I was no longer the confused, vulnerable father she could manipulate with a sweet voice and a counterfeit smile. I was the architect of my own empire, and I was actively tearing down the pathetic, treacherous scaffolding she and Wyatt had attempted to build around my life. The hot steam rose from the dark puddle on the floor, carrying the bitter scent of her failed conspiracy into the open air. Alyssa jumped back violently, a sharp, unscripted scream tearing through her throat as the boiling tea splashed dangerously close to her designer shoes. She scrambled backward against the stainless steel refrigerator, her eyes wide with genuine, unfiltered shock. The maternal caring mask melted away instantly, revealing the terrified, cornered criminal underneath. She stared at the shattered porcelain and the dark stains spreading across the hardwood, her chest heaving as her mind struggled to process the sudden aggressive shift in my behavior. I did not give her a single second to recover her composure or formulate a new lie. I placed my hands flat on the cold granite island and leaned far across the heavy stone, invading her physical space with deliberate, overwhelming intimidation. My eyes locked onto hers, cold and entirely uncompromising. I did not yell. I let my voice drop into a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper that carried the lethal weight of an absolute certainty. I told her that next time she decided to purchase synthetic psychedelics on the black market, she needed to remind her husband to clear his encrypted browser history. The words struck her with the paralyzing force of a physical blow. The remaining color drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a chalky, sickly white. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She realized in a fraction of a second that I possessed total, devastating knowledge of their entire operation. I knew about the dark web transactions, the specific chemical compounds, and Wyatt's digital footprints. The hidden micro camera in my glasses continued to capture every micro-expression of her crumbling reality. The $80 million fortune she thought she had securely trapped within the fraudulent tax forms on the counter had just vanished into thin air, replaced instantly by the terrifying specter of federal prison. The profound realization that she was completely and undeniably caught shattered her remaining defenses. Alyssa spun away from the kitchen island, her high heels slipping frantically against the wet floor as she scrambled out of the room. She bolted down the hallway toward the expansive living room, moving with the sheer, uncoordinated panic of a rat fleeing a burning maze. I walked slowly behind her, watching her desperately dig her cell phone out of her cashmere coat pocket. She punched the screen with trembling, frantic fingers, dialing Wyatt with extreme urgency. The moment the call connected, her voice escalated into a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She screamed into the receiver that the entire plan was blown, that I knew everything about the chemicals, and that I was completely lucid. She paced erratically across the Persian rug, clutching the phone to her ear like a lifeline, absorbing whatever panicked instructions Wyatt was barking back at her. Her tone suddenly shifted from raw terror to a dark, desperate aggression. She yelled into the phone that they could not wait for the financial transfer to clear, organically demanding that he trigger the emergency backup protocol immediately. She confirmed to Wyatt that they had no other choice but to initiate the forced psychiatric hold tonight. They were going to bypass the subtle poisoning and resort to brute, overwhelming legal and medical force. They intended to dispatch an involuntary extraction team to my estate under the guise of an acute, violent mental health crisis, aiming to have me physically dragged from my home and locked inside a secure facility before the sun rose. I stood quietly in the archway of the living room, listening to the frantic escalation of their conspiracy. The final desperate phase of their assault had been triggered. The heavy grandfather clock in the central hallway struck exactly 1 a.m, its deep, resonant chimes vibrating through the silent, shadowed estate. Precisely on cue, the harsh, rhythmic flash of red and white emergency lights violently pierced the darkness of my living room, sweeping aggressively across the Persian rugs and bouncing off the antique silver mirrors. They did not bother to ring the doorbell or wait for a civilized invitation. The heavy oak front door shuddered under a massive physical impact before bursting open, the reinforced brass lock splintering inward with a deafening crack. Wyatt stormed into the foyer, his face flushed with adrenaline and manufactured panic. He had completely abandoned his food poisoning charade from the hospital, moving with the erratic, desperate energy of a cornered animal pushing for a final lethal strike. Behind him marched 2 massive, thick-necked men wearing clinical white uniforms that stretched tightly across their heavy frames. They were not legitimate paramedics dispatched to save a life. They were hired muscle-brutal orderlies recruited from the darkest, least regulated corners of the private medical sector. Flanking Wyatt was a sharply dressed man gripping a pristine leather clipboard. His tailored suit and polished shoes clashed violently with the midnight home invasion. This was the corrupt psychiatrist they had purchased with my stolen equity, a man perfectly willing to trade his medical license and basic human morality for a cut of an $80 million fortune. The intrusion was executed with military precision designed entirely to disorient, terrify, and extract a vulnerable target before anyone could ask questions or verify their legal authority. They flooded into my private sanctuary, bringing the cold, clinical violence of an institution directly into my living room, completely convinced they held the absolute element of surprise. The tailored psychiatrist did not hesitate or attempt any form of professional medical assessment. He stepped directly in front of Wyatt, marching toward where I sat in the center of the living room, and thrust his clipboard aggressively into my line of sight. A single sheet of thick paper was pinned to the board, bearing a flurry of dense legal text and several bright red official notary stamps. He announced himself with supreme, unearned authority, his voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceilings. He declared that he had reviewed extensive eyewitness testimony and compelling physical evidence proving I was suffering from a severe acute psychotic break. He stated for the official record that I presented an immediate catastrophic danger to myself and to my family. The falsified medical hold order in his hand was their ultimate weapon, a legally binding document forged from Alyssa's lies and Wyatt's stolen cash, designed to strip away my constitutional rights in a matter of seconds. The doctor did not ask me a single diagnostic question. He did not check my pulse, monitor my breathing, or evaluate my cognitive state. He simply looked down at me with cold, absolute contempt and turned his head toward the two massive orderlies standing by the shattered front door. He raised his hand and sharply commanded the medics to deploy their heavy physical restraints. He instructed them to secure my arms and legs immediately, citing a high probability of violent resistance based on my newly fabricated medical history. He wanted me bound, gagged, and dragged out of my own home like a rabid dog before the neighborhood could even register the flashing lights illuminating the driveway. I did not scream. I did not leap from my chair to protest my sanity or beg for mercy. I remained entirely seated in the deep confines of my tufted leather armchair, the very picture of absolute, unshakable tranquility. The room buzzed with the chaotic, aggressive energy of a violent extraction, yet I simply reached over to the mahogany side table and picked up a steaming mug of black coffee. I lifted the ceramic rim to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter, scalding liquid wash over my tongue. My total lack of panic caused a brief, highly visible fracture in Wyatt's manufactured confidence. He expected raw terror. He expected an old man thrashing blindly against the inevitable, providing the perfect physical justification for the harsh measures they were about to deploy. Instead, he found a man holding court in his own home, watching the intrusion with the detached, analytical gaze of an engineer observing a fatally flawed structural collapse. The two massive orderlies completely ignored my calm demeanor. They stepped forward in total unison, their heavy rubber-soled boots squeaking against the polished hardwood. The lead orderly reached into the deep cargo pockets of his white uniform and pulled out a set of thick, heavy-duty leather restraint straps. The thick metal buckles clinked together with a sinister, metallic chime as he unrolled the restraints, his cold eyes locking onto my wrists. They moved to flank the leather armchair, closing off my physical escape routes with practiced, brutal efficiency. The corrupt psychiatrist nodded in grim satisfaction, entirely ready to sign the final transfer paperwork the moment the leather straps dug into my skin. They believed the game was officially over. The heavy oak door connecting the living room to the expansive kitchen swung open with a sudden, violent crash that shattered the tense atmosphere. The two orderlies froze mid-stride, their heavy leather straps dangling uselessly from their massive hands. Oliver, my lead corporate attorney, stepped directly into the harsh flashing light of the foyer. He did not look like a man roused from sleep. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, his posture radiating the absolute unforgiving authority of a legal titan executing a flawless counterstrike. Oliver did not come alone. He stepped aside, allowing 5 imposing figures to file past him into the living room. Leading the group were 3 distinguished gray-haired individuals wearing formal attire and carrying thick briefcases. These were not local bureaucrats. They were the most prestigious, uncompromising medical board directors in the state, the exact governing body holding the absolute power to permanently revoke the medical license of the corrupt psychiatrist currently standing in my home. Flanking the directors were 2 heavily armed, uniformed police officers, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts, their sharp eyes immediately assessing the illegal extraction team. The corrupt psychiatrist instantly went completely pale, his expensive leather clipboard slipping from his trembling fingers and crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. Wyatt staggered backward, his mouth opening in absolute speechless horror as the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation finally dawned on him. They had brought forged documents and hired muscle to a midnight ambush. I had brought the supreme medical authority of the state and the full, undeniable weight of the criminal justice system. The trap I had meticulously built from their own arrogance and greed snapped shut with bone-crushing finality. The suffocating standoff in the center of my living room stretched into a tense, agonizing silence. The aggressive bravado that Wyatt and his hired mercenaries had brought into my home evaporated the exact moment Oliver and his heavily armed, highly credentialed entourage crossed the threshold. The three distinguished medical board directors did not waste a single second surveying the shattered front door or the bewildered orderlies. They locked their collective gaze directly onto the corrupt psychiatrist, moving forward with the synchronized precision of an execution squad. The lead director, an imposing woman with silver hair and a notoriously unforgiving reputation, extended her hand and demanded the immediate surrender of the fraudulent medical hold order. The corrupt doctor's tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big as he physically shrank under her blistering scrutiny. His polished demeanor completely dissolved into raw panic. The director relentlessly interrogated him right there on my Persian rug, demanding to know the exact diagnostic protocol he utilized to determine my supposed acute psychosis. She demanded the dates of my clinical evaluations, the blood panel results, and the corresponding neurological imaging that justified a midnight forced extraction. The bought-off professional could not produce a single coherent sentence. He stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the shattered entryway, thick beads of sweat pooling on his forehead and trailing down his neck. He desperately attempted to reference second-hand eyewitness testimony citing Wyatt's fabricated claims of my erratic behavior. The directors verbally dismantled him on the spot, loudly reminding him that issuing a mandatory psychiatric hold without a direct verifiable patient examination was a catastrophic violation of medical ethics. The sheer weight of their unyielding authority crushed his remaining defenses, leaving him trembling and utterly exposed as a pathetic fraud. The total collapse of the medical facade served as the immediate trigger for law enforcement to intervene. The 2 armed police officers who had been standing silently by the archway assessing the threat level stepped forward with heavy, synchronized strides. The metallic rattle of handcuffs being drawn from their utility belts cut sharply through the heavy tension of the room. The lead officer, a stern veteran who had reviewed Oliver's extensive preemptive legal filings earlier that evening, bypassed Wyatt completely and walked straight up to the sweating psychiatrist. He did not offer any courteous warnings or professional deferrals. He grabbed the doctor's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced, uncompromising force, and loudly read him his rights. The charges echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of my estate, listing acute medical fraud, gross criminal negligence, and the deliberate falsification of official state health documents. The 2 massive, thick-necked orderlies immediately dropped their heavy leather restraint straps onto the floorboards, raising their hands in the air to violently distance themselves from the crumbling conspiracy. They were hired muscle paid to intimidate an old man absolutely unwilling to face felony conspiracy charges or assault an armed police officer. They backed away toward the wall, entirely neutralizing themselves as a physical threat. The corrupt doctor let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper as the steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists, locking him into a grim reality. He begged the medical board directors for clemency, pleading that he had been aggressively coerced and financially manipulated into signing the mandate. His desperate cowardice only cemented the absolute legality of the arrest. Oliver watched the scene unfold with a predator's cold satisfaction, stepping aside as the officer physically dragged the disgraced handcuffed physician out of the living room. With his primary weapon neutralized and his hired authority figure being shoved into the back of a police cruiser, the reality of the situation violently slammed into Wyatt. The absolute arrogance that had fueled his midnight home invasion evaporated, replaced by the frantic, undeniable instinct of a trapped coward. He realized his master plan to illegally seize my $80 million fortune had just resulted in a felony arrest right in front of his eyes. While the officers were securing the disgraced doctor and commanding the orderlies to stand against the far wall, Wyatt attempted to utilize the chaos to secure his own miserable survival. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, trying to quietly merge with the shadows near the splintered oak doorframe. He kept his head lowered, sliding his expensive leather shoes silently across the hardwood, desperately inching his way toward the open driveway and the temporary safety of the dark, freezing night. He actually believed he could simply walk away from the catastrophic wreckage he had orchestrated. He made it exactly 2 feet past the threshold before a heavy, unyielding hand slammed directly into the center of his chest. The second police officer, who had anticipated the exact flight response of a guilty man, completely blocked the exit path. The officer shoved Wyatt violently backward, sending him stumbling clumsily over the edge of the Persian rug. Wyatt crashed hard onto his knees in the absolute dead center of the brightly lit living room. Total, suffocating panic overtook his features. His chest heaved erratically, his eyes darting around the room looking for an exit that no longer existed. The smug, entitled son-in-law who had confidently ordered violent debt collectors to my estate was now shivering on my floor, completely surrounded and entirely out of options. The sudden heavy thud of Wyatt hitting the floorboards finally broke Alyssa's paralyzing shock. She had been standing frozen near the entryway, watching her entire criminal empire disintegrate in a matter of minutes. Stripped of her fraudulent medical mandate and witnessing her husband cornered by armed police, she resorted to the only weapon she had left. She weaponized her own hysteria. Alyssa lunged forward, her face contorted into a mask of wild, manufactured terror. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She shrieked to the officers and the medical board directors that I was a violently unstable sociopath, claiming I had orchestrated this entire elaborate setup to mask my own deep, terrifying insanity. Her voice cracked with desperate aggression as she demanded they ignore the failed psychiatric hold and arrest me for endangering her family. I did not raise my voice to interrupt her frantic, pathetic performance. I did not offer a single word of defense or justification to the authorities standing in my home. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the glowing screen. I bypassed the security lock, opened the uncompressed digital file I had purchased in the dark alleyway, and pushed the volume up to its absolute maximum limit. Diego's covert high-definition recording began to play. The crisp, undeniable sound of the restaurant's ambient noise filled the room, followed immediately by the visual evidence of Alyssa twisting the synthetic capsule apart and dumping the lethal hallucinogenic powder directly into my red wine. The glowing screen projected her casual, remorseless act of attempted assassination for everyone to see. The undeniable proof instantly silenced her hysterical screaming, plunging the room into a devastating, breathless quiet. The sheer weight of the digital evidence crushed the last remnants of Alyssa's hysteria. She stared at the glowing screen of my smartphone, completely paralyzed as her own remorseless act of attempted assassination played out in high definition. The lead police officer, his face hardened with absolute disgust, immediately unclipped a second pair of steel handcuffs from his heavy utility belt and stepped toward my daughter. I raised my right hand, my palm flat and commanding, instantly signaling the armed officer to stand down. He paused, his sharp eyes questioning my sudden intervention. I stated with absolute unwavering clarity that I was not pressing formal criminal charges against my daughter tonight. Handing her over to the sterile machinery of the local precinct was far too quick and far too merciful a punishment for her calculated treason. The immediate shock of a jail cell would only trigger their highly paid defense attorneys, shielding them behind endless bureaucratic delays and bail hearings. I wanted them to experience the sheer agonizing terror of complete uncertainty. I ordered Wyatt and Alyssa out of my house immediately. I instructed them to return to their heavily leveraged penthouse and wait for the devastating legal avalanche that would soon completely bury their lives. The psychological torture of knowing the FBI and the state authorities possessed undeniable proof of their federal crimes would break their arrogant minds far faster than cold steel handcuffs ever could. Wyatt grabbed Alyssa by the arm, roughly pulling her toward the splintered front door. They stumbled out into the freezing night air, completely stripped of their power, their dignity, and their fraudulent medical mandate. I stood in the center of my living room alongside Oliver and the authorities, watching the taillights of their vehicle vanish down the dark driveway. The midnight ambush was over, but the financial execution was just beginning. The sun had barely risen over the city's skyline when Oliver and I walked through the towering glass doors of the National Bank's primary headquarters. We completely bypassed the main public lobby and the local branch managers who had so easily rubber-stamped Alyssa's fraudulent $500,000 mortgage. We rode the private executive elevator directly to the top floor, entering a sprawling, soundproofed boardroom designated exclusively for top-tier wealth management. The bank's regional vice president sat waiting nervously at the head of a massive mahogany table flanked by 2 senior corporate legal counsels. They were fully aware of the catastrophic security breach that had occurred under their watch and they were utterly terrified of the massive civil litigation Oliver could unleash upon their institution. I did not offer them a polite greeting or accept the glass of imported sparkling water they desperately pushed across the polished wood. I simply took my seat and demanded the immediate presentation of the ultimate financial restructuring documents. The vice president quickly slid a massive, intimidating stack of heavy legal contracts across the table. I drew my own gold fountain pen from my tailored suit jacket, refusing to use the bank's supplied materials. I began signing the bottom line of each page with absolute mechanical precision. My hand moved with the swift, flawless muscle memory of a master engineer approving structural blueprints. There was no hesitation, no slight tremor at the end of my pen strokes. I permanently overwrote the terrible vulnerability Alyssa had exploited, replacing it with an impenetrable legal fortress. Oliver scrutinized every single clause before I placed my signature, ensuring the bank's lawyers had executed my strict operational directives perfectly. I was methodically locking the vault on my life's work, entirely cutting off the oxygen supply to Wyatt and Alyssa's parasitic existence. The final stroke of my pen initiated a devastating, irreversible financial protocol. The entire $80 million payout from the sale of my commercial engineering firm was instantaneously transferred out of my standard personal accounts. The massive sum vanished from the vulnerable banking grid, landing cleanly into an irrevocable blind trust. This specific aggressive legal structure completely removed my direct ownership of the funds, placing the entire fortune under the absolute unilateral control of an independent, highly vetted fiduciary board. Wyatt and Alyssa could forge 1,000 signatures and bribe 100 corrupt psychiatrists, but they could never legally touch a single cent of that money again. Even a judge could not forcefully break the ironclad parameters of the trust to satisfy Wyatt's violent gambling debts. The $80 million was permanently secured entirely out of their greedy reach. I did not stop at securing the corporate buyout. I turned my attention directly to the bleeding arteries of my immediate personal wealth. I commanded the sweating bank vice president to immediately sever and permanently cancel every single supplementary credit card attached to my primary accounts. For 3 years, I had generously provided Alyssa and Wyatt with limitless black cards, actively financing their lavish penthouse, their luxury imported vehicles, and their exorbitant fine dining habits, while I lived quietly on my estate. I watched the bank executive type frantically on his encrypted laptop, his keystrokes sending instant catastrophic cancellation codes directly to the global credit networks. The heavy digital guillotine fell with absolute finality. I stripped away their massive financial safety net in a matter of seconds, leaving them entirely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of their own massive debts. The immense, invisible pipeline of my generational wealth was officially cut. Across the city, completely oblivious to the massive financial execution occurring in the bank's executive boardroom, Alyssa desperately attempted to self-medicate her mounting terror with retail therapy. She stood arrogantly at the polished marble checkout counter of an exclusive, high-end designer boutique situated in the wealthiest retail district of the city. 2 of her equally shallow, status-obsessed socialite friends flanked her, watching enviously as she casually prepared to purchase a rare $10,000 imported leather handbag. Alyssa needed the quick synthetic rush of a massive transaction to soothe her violently frayed nerves after the catastrophic failure of the midnight ambush. She reached into her designer clutch and confidently pulled out the heavy metal black card tied directly to my personal fortune. She slid it across the marble counter with a smug, entitled smile, entirely expecting the familiar submissive deference of the boutique staff. The young cashier swiped the heavy metal card through the boutique's primary digital terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, highly disruptive electronic beep. The screen flashed a stark, bright red error code indicating a hard decline. Alyssa scoffed, blaming the machinery and loudly demanding the cashier run the premium card again. The cashier complied, but the secondary terminal immediately triggered an aggressive automated fraud alert directly from the global credit network. The boutique manager, a stern woman impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, quickly stepped forward and took the metal card from the cashier's trembling hands. The manager looked at the terminal screen, then looked directly into Alyssa's horrified eyes. Following the strict, non-negotiable security protocols dictated by the bank for a permanently revoked account, the manager pulled a heavy pair of industrial shears from beneath the counter. She sliced the heavy metal black card cleanly in half, letting the 2 useless pieces clatter loudly onto the marble surface while Alyssa's wealthy friends gasped in absolute shock. the illusion of her infinite wealth shattered completely in plain sight. Wyatt paced the expansive floor of the penthouse, his expensive silk shirt stained with nervous sweat from the catastrophic failure at the estate. The private elevator chimed, depositing a bonded legal courier directly into his foyer. The courier handed Wyatt a thick, certified envelope bearing the gold-embossed seal of the National Bank's fraud division. Wyatt tore through the heavy paper, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal print. The document was a formal notice of immediate asset seizure. Oliver had not only secured the $80 million, he had initiated a forensic audit of every transaction connected to my name. The bank had officially flagged the $500,000 second mortgage Wyatt had secured against my property as a blatant signature forgery. Because the stolen funds had been illegally funneled into the equity of their luxury penthouse, the bank was exercising its unilateral right to initiate immediate non-judicial foreclosure. The letter explicitly stated that all access codes to the building would be deactivated within 48 hours, and local sheriffs were already scheduled to execute a forced eviction. Wyatt dropped the paper, his hands shaking violently as the reality of absolute financial ruin crushed his lungs. The stolen capital he used to bribe the corrupt psychiatrist, purchase black market narcotics, and maintain his lavish facade was gone. He was no longer a wealthy corporate investor. He was a desperate criminal facing imminent homelessness and federal indictment. The heavy mahogany door of the penthouse did not chime or swing open gently. It exploded inward with the deafening crash of splintering wood and sheared metal hinges. The violent debt collectors who had silently stalked my driveway days earlier had entirely lost their patience. They stormed into the pristine living room, their heavy combat boots tracking dirt across the white imported carpets. The lead enforcer, a massive man with cold, dead eyes, stepped over the ruined door and drew a solid aluminum baseball bat from beneath his heavy leather jacket. He did not ask for a timeline or offer an extension. He swung the bat with brutal, terrifying force, instantly shattering a custom crystal dining table into 1,000 flying shards. Wyatt let out a pathetic, high-pitched scream, scrambling backward until his spine hit the panoramic glass window overlooking the city skyline. The enforcer stepped forward, driving the tip of the cold aluminum bat directly into Wyatt's sternum, pinning him against the glass. He spoke in a low, raspy voice, devoid of any human empathy, demanding the immediate repayment of the $300,000 Wyatt had borrowed from the underground syndicate. The loan sharks did not care about frozen bank accounts, forged mortgages, or federal investigations. They cared strictly about cash, and they promised to extract their payment in broken bones if the money was not wired by midnight. The enforcer smashed a massive flat-screen television on his way out, leaving Wyatt trembling in the wreckage of his shattered sanctuary. The heavy silence left in the wake of the violent intrusion was broken only by the sound of Alyssa's footsteps. She had just returned from the catastrophic humiliation at the luxury boutique, stepping into the ruined penthouse with a face pale from shock. She stared at the smashed furniture, the shattered glass, and her husband shivering against the panoramic window. Wyatt looked up, and the absolute terror in his eyes instantly morphed into a dark, venomous rage. The sophisticated, charming son-in-law facade evaporated, revealing the ruthless, parasitic coward underneath. He lunged away from the window and marched directly toward Alyssa, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He screamed that this entire collapse was exclusively her fault. He blamed her for failing to execute the simple poisoning at the dinner table, for lacking the nerve to secure the $80 million, and for allowing an old man to outsmart them at every single turn. Alyssa tried to defend herself, raising her hands and pleading that they were supposed to be partners in the buyout. Wyatt let out a dark, cruel laugh. He explicitly declared that she was never a partner, just a convenient, gullible tool he used to access a generational fortune. When Alyssa opened her mouth to scream back, Wyatt snapped. He swung his arm with vicious, unbridled force, striking her violently across the face. The brutal impact echoed sharply through the ruined living room, sending Alyssa crashing hard onto the floor. Alyssa hit the ground with a heavy thud, her designer clothes tearing against the sharp, jagged remains of the shattered crystal dining table. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as a sharp, burning pain radiated across her jaw. A warm trickle of dark blood slid slowly from the corner of her mouth, dripping onto the pristine white carpet beneath her. She sat completely still amidst the wreckage, her trembling fingers gently touching her bruised, swollen cheek. Wyatt did not offer a single glance of remorse. He simply stepped over her fallen body, cursing under his breath as he frantically began tearing through the bedroom drawers, desperately searching for any hidden cash or valuable watches to appease the loan sharks. Alyssa remained on the floor, the cold reality of her absolute betrayal washing over her like freezing water. The brutal physical strike shattered the last lingering delusion she held about her marriage. She realized with terrifying clarity that she had systematically destroyed the life of a father who had unconditionally loved, protected, and financed her entire existence, all to please a violent, manipulative coward who saw her strictly as an expendable asset. She had traded an impenetrable fortress of family loyalty for a fragile house of cards built entirely on greed, and now that the money was gone, her worth had dropped to zero. She sat bleeding in the ruins of her stolen penthouse, completely isolated and entirely out of options. The financial execution, executed within the bank's highest boardroom, effectively severed Wyatt's access to my wealth, but mere bankruptcy was an insufficient penalty for a man who had attempted to erase my existence. Stripping away his fraudulent capital and exposing him to the violent wrath of underground loan sharks served as a satisfactory opening maneuver. However, I demanded absolute structural annihilation of his entire reality. I sat behind the heavy oak desk in my private study, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across the polished wood. Oliver walked into the room with his usual brisk professional efficiency, carrying a thick leather-bound dossier. He placed the heavy file directly in front of me, tapping the cover with a single deliberate strike of his index finger. The dossier contained a meticulously assembled record of Wyatt's highly encrypted secondary credit card expenditures stretching back over the past 24 months. While Alyssa believed her husband was exclusively funding their lavish penthouse lifestyle and maintaining his high society image, the forensic audit revealed a massive hidden hemorrhage of capital flowing in an entirely different direction. I opened the folder, my eyes tracing the rigid columns of black ink. The financial ledger detailed a relentless sequence of high-end purchases completely disconnected from Alyssa's orbit. There were receipts for imported baby furniture, premium pediatric healthcare retainers, and regular massive cash withdrawals entirely untraceable to his corporate accounts. The sheer volume of the expenditures painted a vivid, undeniable portrait of a man maintaining a deeply entrenched double life. Oliver silently slid a highlighted bank statement across the desk, directing my attention to a recurring massive monthly payment. It was a secondary mortgage payment routed through a shell company tied to an address located miles away from the city center. I memorized the precise coordinates of the hidden property and immediately left the estate, determined to visually verify the ultimate destination of my stolen funds. I drove my dark sedan away from the chaotic, aggressive energy of the city's financial district, navigating toward the quiet, affluent outer suburbs. The landscape shifted dramatically from towering glass skyscrapers to manicured, tree-lined avenues and expansive gated communities designed entirely for upper-class families seeking absolute privacy. I followed the navigation system deep into an exclusive, pristine subdivision where the houses boasted immaculate landscaping, wide sidewalks, and expensive security perimeters. I slowed the vehicle, pulling smoothly against the curb of a quiet cul-de-sac. I parked the sedan directly across the street from the specific address listed on Wyatt's secret financial statements. The property was a stunning, newly constructed luxury townhouse featuring a modern brick facade, custom architectural windows, and a meticulously paved driveway. It was a picture-perfect suburban sanctuary entirely insulated from the violent, parasitic reality of Wyatt's actual existence. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling, watching the quiet residence with absolute analytical precision. The sheer audacity of the purchase was staggering. Wyatt had not simply rented a discreet apartment for temporary dalliances. He had actively established a permanent, fully funded secondary estate right under Alyssa's nose. This serene environment stood in violent contrast to the smashed glass and bloody consequences currently unfolding in his primary residence. I turned off the ignition and stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp morning air doing nothing to cool the cold anger settling in my chest. I crossed the immaculate asphalt street, my footsteps echoing sharply against the quiet suburban silence. I approached the heavy wooden front door of the townhouse, fully prepared to physically confront the hidden variable in Wyatt's grand treacherous equation. I raised my hand and knocked firmly on the solid wood door, delivering 3 sharp, authoritative strikes that demanded an immediate answer. The heavy deadbolt clicked almost instantly, and the door swung open to reveal the exact reason for Wyatt's desperate, escalating criminal behavior. A young woman with bright blonde hair and soft, welcoming features stood in the threshold. She was dressed in comfortable, high-end casual wear, projecting an aura of quiet domestic bliss an unquestioned financial security. Resting securely against her chest in a designer infant carrier was a newborn baby entirely peaceful and completely oblivious to the massive storm currently annihilating its father's primary life. My highly analytical mind instantly processed the visual data, seamlessly connecting the timelines, the secret expenditures, and the massive financial theft. The young woman offered a polite, questioning smile, assuming I was a lost delivery driver or a wandering neighbor seeking directions. She had absolutely no idea that the man standing on her porch was the true architect of the wealth surrounding her. The horrifying truth clicked into place with absolute devastating clarity. The $500,000 second mortgage that Wyatt had illegally secured by forging my signature on fraudulent banking documents was never utilized to expand his corporate portfolio or save his failing investments. That massive injection of stolen capital was used entirely to purchase this pristine suburban townhouse in pure, untraceable cash. He had literally stolen the equity out of my home to build a safe haven for his new family. Wyatt had masterfully manipulated Alyssa into believing they were building a unified empire, all while systematically siphoning my wealth to secure a future that categorically excluded her. The depth of his deception was absolute. The ultimate sickening scope of Wyatt's master plan finally crystallized in my mind. He possessed a fully established second family carefully hidden away in this wealthy suburban fortress. The violent rush to declare me mentally incompetent and seize control of the $80 million corporate buyout was never intended to settle his crushing underground gambling debts or repair his fractured marriage with my daughter. The $80 million was his ultimate exit strategy. He intended to drain my life's work, abandon the collapsing wreckage of his penthouse, leave Alyssa to face the absolute ruin alone, and permanently vanish into a luxurious, untethered future with this blonde woman and their newborn child. He was entirely willing to destroy my mind and sacrifice Alyssa's freedom to fund his cowardly escape across international borders. I did not speak a single word to the young woman standing in the doorway. I simply raised my smartphone. The camera lens focused with deadly precision and rapidly captured a series of high-definition photographs. I documented the woman's confused expression, the newborn baby resting securely against her chest, and the address placard bolted to the expensive brick facade. The digital shutter clicked silently, securing the ultimate, undeniable proof of Wyatt's supreme betrayal. The young woman took a hesitant step backward, her polite smile vanishing into deep discomfort as she moved to close the heavy door against the strange intruder. I did not attempt to stop her or offer an explanation. I turned on my heel and walked deliberately back to my sedan. I now possessed the exact psychological weapon required to completely shatter whatever pathetic lingering delusions Alyssa still held regarding her marriage. The trap was fully loaded, and it was time to unleash absolute, uncompromising devastation. The text message from Oliver's firm dictated a specific time and floor number, completely devoid of any familial warmth or standard pleasantries. I sat entirely still in the high-backed leather chair of the downtown conference room, the vast glass windows framing the unforgiving concrete landscape of the financial district below. The heavy mahogany doors swung open right on the scheduled minute. Alyssa stepped into the sterile corporate environment, looking entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, impeccably groomed socialite who had attempted to poison me just days prior. Her expensive cashmere coat was wrinkled and haphazardly buttoned, clearly thrown on in a state of absolute panic. The left side of her jaw bore an ugly, blossoming purple bruise, a direct and brutal testament to Wyatt's true nature when stripped of his stolen capital and cornered by his own failures. She clutched a damaged designer handbag tightly against her chest, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperate to locate a lifeline. She genuinely believed this summons represented an opening for negotiation. She assumed my paternal instincts had finally overridden my logical defenses, hoping I had called her here to draft a massive financial bailout agreement that would save her from the encroaching underground loan sharks and the impending bank foreclosure. She shuffled toward the long, frosted glass table, pulling out a chair with trembling hands. She opened her mouth to speak clearly, formulating a desperate, tearful apology designed to extract whatever capital she could manipulate out of me. I did not grant her a single second to deploy her manufactured tears. I raised my hand in a sharp cutting motion, instantly silencing the practiced lie forming on her swollen lips. I offered absolutely no greeting, no comfort, and no acknowledgement of the physical abuse she had so clearly endured at the hands of her husband. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and extracted the thick stack of high-definition photographs I had personally captured in the quiet suburban cul-de-sac. I brought my arm down in a swift, fluid arc, slapping the glossy images directly onto the center of the cold glass table. The physical force of the impact made her flinch, her shoulders drawing inward as the heavy paper fanned out perfectly across the transparent surface. I ordered her to look at the reality she had actively attempted to murder me to finance. Alyssa leaned forward hesitantly, her eyes dropping to the scattered photographs. The vibrant, undeniable colors of Wyatt's secret life screamed up at her from the table. She saw the pristine brick townhouse entirely insulated from the financial wreckage of their shared penthouse. She saw the beautiful, unblemished blonde woman standing in the doorway, radiating the exact domestic security Alyssa had just violently lost. The high-resolution evidence cut through the sterile air of the boardroom, executing the final devastating blow to her fractured reality. Her eyes locked onto the central photograph, the image capturing the ultimate devastating truth. The shot displayed Wyatt standing proudly on the suburban porch, leaning forward to gently kiss the blonde woman on the forehead while a newborn child rested securely in a carrier against her chest. The timeline materialized instantly in Alyssa's mind, linking Wyatt's sudden massive cash demands and the fraudulent $500,000 mortgage explicitly to the creation of this hidden family. Every single manipulation, every calculated lie, and every ounce of deadly poison she had poured into my tea had been strictly to fund her husband's permanent escape from her. She had willingly destroyed her father, obliterated her inheritance, and legally compromised herself for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable, heavily leveraged asset. The last remaining fragment of her profound arrogance snapped. Alyssa let out a ragged, suffocating gasp as the absolute totality of her betrayal crushed the air from her lungs. She slumped forward, her bruised cheek pressing hard against the cold glass table right beside the images of her husband's child. A dark, primal scream ripped out of her throat. It was a guttural, terrifying sound of pure, unfiltered agony echoing violently off the soundproofed walls of the corporate boardroom. She clawed at the edge of the table, her manicured nails scraping uselessly against the glass as her entire reality burned to ash. The psychological destruction was absolute, far more punishing than any physical cage the authorities could ever construct. I watched her writhe in the ruins of her own catastrophic choices, feeling absolutely zero inclination to pull her from the wreckage. The pathetic weeping criminal slumped across the table was no longer my daughter. She was simply a failed predator caught entirely in a trap of her own design. I stood up slowly, pushing my leather chair back across the carpet with a definitive scrape. I deliberately reached down and buttoned the center button of my suit jacket, securing my armor as I prepared to exit the battlefield. Oliver stepped toward the heavy mahogany doors, pulling them open to clear my path and standing as a silent sentry. I looked down at Alyssa, my voice entirely stripped of any remaining parental warmth. It carried only the cold, unyielding weight of a final verdict. I told her she had willingly invited a parasitic demon into our lives out of sheer, unadulterated greed. I informed her that the corporate bailout she expected did not exist, and I would not spend a single cent of my secured fortune to shield her from the federal authorities or the violent loan sharks actively hunting her husband. I ordered her to clean up her own trash. I turned my back on her, agonized sobbing, stepping through the doorway and walking briskly down the pristine corporate corridor. I left her entirely alone in the boardroom, drowning completely in the inescapable depths of her own absolute ruin. Alyssa navigated the city traffic in a state of absolute blinding fury. The shock of my revelation in the boardroom had entirely burned away, leaving behind a toxic, explosive rage. She clutched the high-definition photographs of Wyatt's secret suburban family so tightly her manicured nails bit deeply into her palms. She arrived at the luxury building and bypassed the shattered remnants of the penthouse door, a violent reminder of the loan sharks who had visited hours earlier. Wyatt was currently in the master bedroom, frantically throwing designer clothes and whatever minor valuables he could find into a canvas duffel bag. He was preparing to abandon her to the incoming financial slaughter. Alyssa marched directly into the room and hurled the stack of glossy photographs straight into his face. The undeniable images of his blonde mistress and the newborn baby scattered across the expensive duvet. Wyatt froze, his eyes locking onto the exact proof of his supreme betrayal. Alyssa did not wait for his pathetic excuses. She launched herself at him, her hands clawing wildly at his silk shirt. The confrontation instantly detonated into a chaotic, violent struggle. They crashed through the hallway, smashing into the remaining intact furniture and tearing heavy framed artwork from the walls. Alyssa screamed with the raw, guttural intensity of a woman who had sacrificed her father and her future for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable asset. She hurled a heavy brass lamp at his head, shattering a mirrored closet door into 1,000 jagged pieces. Wyatt dodged the impact, his face twisting from caught desperation into pure, unadulterated malice. The carefully constructed illusion of their high society marriage disintegrated into a brutal physical brawl amidst the ruins of their foreclosed home. Wyatt looked at the scattered photographs on the floor and realized his ultimate escape hatch was completely obliterated. The $80 million was permanently locked away in my blind trust, and his secret suburban sanctuary had been entirely exposed to the authorities. With the violent underground loan sharks promising to return by midnight to extract their pound of flesh, Wyatt abandoned every remaining shred of his polished corporate persona. He became entirely feral. His desperate eyes darted away from Alyssa's bleeding, bruised face and locked directly onto her left hand. The massive, flawless diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band caught the afternoon light. In Wyatt's panicked, cornered mind, his wife was no longer a human being. She was a walking pawn ticket, his absolute last source of liquid cash to fund his escape. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, tackling Alyssa hard against the damaged hardwood floor. She fought back viciously, kicking and thrashing against his weight, but the physical disparity was too great. Wyatt pinned her shoulders down with his heavy knees, grabbing her left wrist with a bone-crushing grip. He ignored her agonized screams, brutally twisting her hand and yanking at her fingers with zero regard for her physical safety. He forcibly ripped the heavy diamond rings over her swollen knuckles, scraping her skin raw and tearing the flesh. He shoved her away, violently clutching the blood-stained jewelry in his sweaty palm. He had successfully extracted his final payout, completely willing to leave her broken and bleeding on the floor while he ran for his miserable life. The violent, deafening chaos echoing from the penthouse did not go unnoticed. The affluent residents of the luxury building were already in a state of extreme anxiety following the violent intrusion of the debt collectors earlier that day. When Alyssa's terrified, piercing screams began vibrating through the ventilation shafts and the thick walls, multiple neighbors immediately barricaded their doors and dialed emergency services. The dispatch triggered a massive, overwhelming tactical response. Wyatt had just secured the stolen diamond rings in his pocket and grabbed the handle of his canvas duffel bag when the heavy boots of a police unit pounded down the corridor. The officers did not bother issuing a polite warning. They flooded through the already splintered doorway, their weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights sweeping the devastated living room. They found Alyssa lying bruised and bleeding amidst the shattered glass, crying hysterically and pointing a shaking finger directly at her husband. Wyatt froze in the center of the foyer, his eyes wide with absolute panic as he stared down the barrels of 3 service weapons. The commanding officer barked a sharp, undeniable order for Wyatt to drop the bag and raise his hands. When Wyatt hesitated, glancing desperately toward the service elevator, 2 massive officers closed the distance instantly. They tackled him violently to the floor, driving his face hard into the pristine carpet. The cold steel of police handcuffs snapped shut tightly around his wrists, locking his arms securely behind his back. The commanding officer stood over him, loudly reciting his Miranda rights and officially placing him under arrest for severe domestic assault and felony robbery. The arrogant corporate predator was permanently pinned to the ground. The standard operating procedure for a violent felony arrest dictated an immediate, thorough search of the suspect. A veteran police officer hauled Wyatt up onto his knees, roughly patting down the expensive fabric of his tailored suit jacket. The officer reached into Wyatt's right pocket and extracted the blood-stained diamond rings, securing them as direct physical evidence of the robbery. However, the search did not stop there. The officer reached into the deep inner breast pocket of the jacket and pulled out a tightly folded stack of heavy parchment paper. He shook the pages open, his eyes scanning the detailed architectural notations. They were comprehensive, highly accurate blueprints of my private estate, featuring red ink explicitly marking the blind spots in my security grid and the direct access routes to my master bedroom. The commanding officer stepped closer, his expression hardening as the secondary search yielded an even more terrifying discovery. From Wyatt's left pocket, the officer withdrew a small, heavily padded black case. He snapped the lid open, revealing 2 intact, unmarked glass vials filled with a dense, clear liquid. It was the unused, highly lethal synthetic neurotoxin he had purchased on the dark web. The connection was instantaneous and undeniable. The officers realized they were not simply dealing with a desperate husband engaged in a domestic dispute. They possessed physical maps mapping an infiltration route and the exact chemical weapon intended for the assassination. The commanding officer looked down at Wyatt in absolute disgust. He loudly declared to the entire room that the charges were instantly escalating. Wyatt was no longer simply facing assault and robbery. He was being booked for a high-level federal conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. The ultimate trap had completely severed his future. 6 months had passed since the violent climax in the penthouse. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing a gallery that was standing room only. I sat in the front row, my posture rigid and my expression entirely unreadable. Oliver sat directly to my right, his tailored suit immaculate, holding the final legal dossiers that would finalize the execution. Across the wooden barrier, Wyatt sat at the defense table. The arrogant, polished corporate predator I had known was entirely gone. He was a hollowed-out shell of a man. His expensive suits had been replaced by a standard-issue, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his emaciated frame. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights in a maximum security holding cell, terrified of the loan sharks who still demanded their blood money. He trembled constantly, his hands shackled to the heavy metal belt wrapped around his waist. The crushing weight of the federal justice system had broken his mind long before he even stepped into this room. The media filled the designated press boxes, their pens flying across notepads as they documented the sensational downfall of a prominent financial executive turned attempted murderer. The bailiff called the room to order, and a heavy silence descended over the gallery. I did not blink. I kept my gaze locked directly onto the back of Wyatt's head, radiating a cold, unyielding pressure. He slowly turned his head to look back at the gallery, his eyes searching the crowd. When his hollow gaze met mine, he physically flinched, turning back around so quickly his chains rattled loudly against the heavy wooden table. The trial was not a negotiation. It was a formal execution. The lead federal prosecutor stepped up to the podium, projecting an aura of absolute uncompromising authority. He did not bother weaving a complex narrative or appealing to the jury's emotions. He simply unleashed an unstoppable avalanche of empirical evidence. He began by displaying the highly encrypted offshore bank statements detailing the exact flow of the stolen capital intended for Wyatt's second family. He presented the forged signature on the $500,000 secondary mortgage, flanked by sworn testimonies from 3 independent forensic handwriting analysts who confirmed the absolute fraud. The defense attorney sank lower in his chair as the prosecutor projected the digital blueprints of my private estate onto the massive courtroom monitors, specifically highlighting the red ink that marked the direct infiltration route to my master bedroom. Then came the ultimate undeniable weapon. The prosecutor dimmed the lights and played the high-definition security footage captured inside my dining room. The entire gallery gasped in unison as they watched Wyatt deliberately slip the clear synthetic neurotoxin into my tea. The chemical analysis of the 2 identical vials recovered from his jacket pocket matched the toxicity profile perfectly. To seal the absolute destruction of Wyatt's defense, the prosecutor read aloud the recovered text messages between Wyatt and his underground suppliers. The digital logs meticulously detailed his intention to murder me, seize my $80 million trust, and permanently escape the country. Every single message was a nail driven deep into his coffin. The sheer volume of the undeniable proof suffocated the courtroom. Wyatt's high-priced defense attorney offered 0 cross-examination and called 0 witnesses. There was absolutely no defense to mount. The trap I had so carefully constructed had closed with flawless precision, leaving the predator completely paralyzed under the blinding light of federal scrutiny. The federal judge, a stern man with decades of experience handling violent corporate criminals, looked down from the high bench with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He adjusted his glasses and addressed the court, his voice echoing with absolute finality. He stated clearly that in all his years on the bench, he had rarely witnessed a conspiracy so deeply rooted in parasitic greed and callous disregard for human life. He condemned Wyatt for weaponizing his marriage, violating the sanctity of a family home, and utilizing lethal biological agents to execute a financial theft. The judge ordered Wyatt to stand and face the court for his final sentencing. 2 armed federal marshals grabbed Wyatt by his bony arms, forcefully pulling him up onto his trembling feet. The judge did not hesitate. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack that sealed Wyatt's fate. Wyatt was officially sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the charges of conspiracy to commit murder, aggravated assault, and grand financial fraud. The judge explicitly mandated that the sentence would be served entirely without the possibility of parole. There would be no early release for good behavior and no legal loopholes to exploit. Wyatt's legs instantly gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily back into his wooden chair, his shackled hands slamming against the defense table. He dropped his head down onto the hard surface, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob that went entirely ignored by every single person in the room. He was entirely stripped of his freedom, his fraudulent wealth, and his dignity. The violent loan sharks would be waiting for him on the inside, ensuring his 15 years would be a waking nightmare. While the federal marshals aggressively hauled Wyatt away to begin his long, miserable sentence, my eyes drifted toward the back row of the gallery. Alyssa sat completely alone, swallowed by the shadows of the massive wooden doors. She was entirely unrecognizable. The vibrant, arrogant socialite who had demanded my keys and treated me with utter contempt was completely erased. She looked severely emaciated, her expensive designer clothes hanging off her frail frame like a cruel joke. Her bank accounts had been frozen, her high society friends had abandoned her the instant the scandal broke, and she was entirely destitute. The judge cleared his throat, calling her name to address a separate civil ruling tied directly to the criminal proceedings. Because Alyssa was legally married to Wyatt and the $500,000 forged loan had been funneled directly into the equity of their shared penthouse, she was held jointly liable for the financial restitution. The judge slammed his gavel a second time, issuing a binding court order. Every single remaining asset in Alyssa's name, including her vehicles, jewelry, and personal bank accounts, was immediately seized by the state to repay the fraudulent debt. Furthermore, the judge explicitly confirmed the bank's foreclosure on the penthouse, legally ordering Alyssa to completely vacate the premises by midnight tonight. She had absolutely nowhere to go and zero capital to her name. Alyssa stared at the judge with wide, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the reality of her absolute ruin. I stood up from my front row seat, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, calm precision. I did not look back at my daughter. I walked directly past her, stepping out of the heavy courthouse doors and into the bright, warm sunlight of the city, finally breathing the clean air of absolute victory. The sky over the city broke open just after midnight, unleashing a torrential, freezing rain that washed away the last traces of the day's warmth. Alyssa trudged up the steep, winding asphalt road leading to my private estate, her thin designer coat thoroughly soaked and clinging to her shivering frame. The bitter wind whipped her wet, tangled hair across her bruised and swollen face, stinging the raw skin where Wyatt had violently ripped her wedding rings away. She dragged a single broken canvas suitcase behind her, the plastic wheels scraping a harsh, rhythmic protest against the wet pavement. Every agonizing step upward was a physical manifestation of her complete and total ruin. The high society friends who had eagerly drank her champagne and validated her arrogance had vanished the instant the court ordered her assets seized. Her credit cards were deactivated plastic rectangles. Her phone had been disconnected. She was entirely stripped of the unearned luxury she had so ruthlessly sought to protect with a vial of synthetic neurotoxin. She had traded her soul for a man who used her as a human shield and discarded her for a secret family, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the unbearable weight of her own actions. The towering wrought iron gates of my estate finally loomed through the heavy downpour, standing as an impenetrable fortress against the cold, unforgiving night. For the first time in her life, she was positioned on the outside of the gates, looking in at the generational wealth she had actively attempted to murder me to possess. She had nowhere else in the world to go. Her grand, venomous rebellion had ended not in a triumphant corporate takeover, but in a desperate, shivering crawl back to the very father she had plotted to bury. Alyssa stumbled toward the heavy stone pillar anchoring the security perimeter, her numb fingers fumbling blindly in the dark to find the brushed steel call button of the main intercom. She pressed it, leaning her entire trembling weight against the cold, wet masonry. The small red light on the camera housing blinked to life, piercing through the curtain of heavy rain. She did not attempt to mask her devastation or summon the arrogant composure she had wielded so effortlessly in Oliver's downtown law office. She simply broke down. A jagged, uncontrollable sob tore through her throat, echoing through the external speaker system. She pressed her wet, bruised face close to the cold metal grating of the microphone and began to beg with a desperate, animalistic intensity. She cried out my name, pleading for a single ounce of mercy, her voice entirely stripped of pride and entitlement. She begged for the absolute bare minimum, swearing she did not want access to the main house, the corporate trust, or a single cent of the generational fortune she had sought to steal. She pleaded to just be allowed to sleep on the concrete floor of the detached garage to escape the freezing, relentless downpour. Her tears mixed freely with the freezing rain sliding down her cheeks as she offered frantic, impossible promises. She swore she would spend the rest of her natural life making up for her monstrous betrayal, offering to work as a servant, to submit to any punishment, to dedicate every waking moment to atoning for the synthetic neurotoxin and the forged mortgages. She cast the entirety of the blame onto Wyatt's manipulation, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative of her own calculated treason, weeping into the unfeeling steel of the security terminal. I stood perfectly still in the center of my darkened living room, the absolute silence of the estate contrasting violently with the desperate crackling audio broadcasting from the security terminal. The large high-definition monitor cast a pale bluish glow across the polished oak floor, illuminating the stark reality of the situation. I watched the black and white night vision feed intently, observing the shivering, broken figure of my daughter collapsed against the perimeter gate. Her pleas echoed through the silent space, carrying a raw, agonizing frequency that struck directly at the deepest, most vulnerable core of my paternal instincts. Unbidden, a vivid memory forcefully invaded my highly analytical mind. I saw her not as the treacherous woman caught on a federal wiretap, but as a bright-eyed, innocent little girl. I remembered carrying her high upon my shoulders during a summer festival, her tiny hands clutching my hair, her laughter ringing out completely clear and untainted by the parasitic greed that would eventually consume her soul. The phantom weight of that innocent child pressed heavily upon my chest, generating an immense, suffocating pain that threatened to crack my ribs. Every biological imperative demanded I press the release button, swing the heavy iron gates open, and shield my offspring from the freezing storm. The agony of watching her suffer in the freezing rain was a profound physical torture, yet my resolve remained completely structurally unbreakable. I recognized that opening the gate would invalidate the entire agonizing lesson of accountability. Rescuing her from the immediate consequences of her calculated assassination attempt would merely reinforce the exact entitlement that had poisoned her in the first place. The pain was astronomical, but the required discipline was absolute. I refused to let biological sentiment override empirical justice. I stepped forward out of the shadows of the living room, moving deliberately into the pale light cast by the security array. I looked at the digital rendering of her bruised, weeping face on the screen, feeling the cold, unyielding iron of my final verdict lock permanently into place. I reached out and pressed my thumb firmly against the brushed aluminum button to engage the two-way external communication channel. The sharp crackle of static temporarily overpowered the sound of the torrential rain hammering against the camera housing. Alyssa instantly stopped speaking, her breath catching in her throat as she heard the distinct audio cue. She looked up directly into the camera lens with wide, desperate eyes, waiting for the familiar, comforting sound of a father granting a bailout. My voice carried absolutely zero warmth, zero hesitation, and zero paternal leniency. It was an executioner's gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. I leaned into the microphone and spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity that cut straight through the freezing storm. I told her that forgiveness was not on today's menu, and I ordered her to leave my property immediately. I did not wait to hear her reaction. I did not linger to witness the final crushing realization wash over her shattered features as my words permanently severed the last thread of her safety net. I released the communication button, instantly cutting off the audio feed, and reached down to flip the master power switch on the security console. The monitor clicked off, plunging the living room into total absolute darkness. I turned my back on the silent screen and walked slowly, deliberately away, disappearing into the depths of the quiet, impenetrable house, leaving her alone in the cold. 2 months evaporated into a grueling, unrelenting nightmare for Alyssa. The freezing rain of that night outside my gates had only been the opening sequence of her absolute descent. The criminal investigations into Wyatt's federal conspiracy charges cast a massive, inescapable shadow over her remaining existence. While the authorities ultimately determined she lacked the operational capacity to orchestrate the biological assassination attempt, the pending accessory charges and her undeniable involvement in the fraudulent mortgage permanently destroyed her identity. Her pristine credit score plummeted into a catastrophic abyss. Her extensive network of high society friends, the same women who had eagerly toasted her fabricated success, instantly severed all communication. She was utterly toxic, a destitute pariah locked permanently out of the affluent world she had once commanded. Stripped of her luxury vehicles, her designer wardrobe, and her generational safety net, survival became an agonizing daily equation. The relentless reality of eviction forced her into a cramped, decaying studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. With no marketable skills and a background check that triggered immediate rejections from every corporate office, she was forced to accept the absolute lowest rung of the labor market. A desperate visit to a struggling urban staffing agency yielded the only employment opportunity available to someone carrying her specific, highly publicized baggage. She was hired as a contracted, minimum-wage night shift janitor. The hands that had previously held crystal champagne flutes and forged multi-million-dollar banking documents were now issued thick rubber gloves and harsh industrial chemicals. The sheer physical toll of the labor bruised her unaccustomed muscles, breaking her manicured nails and blistering her skin. She spent her nights dragging heavy commercial vacuums and foul-smelling mop buckets through empty corporate lobbies, silently suffocating under the crushing weight of her irreversible choices. The staffing agency did not care about her past or the psychological torture of her assignments. They simply dispatched anonymous labor to fulfill their lucrative corporate cleaning contracts. By a twist of spectacularly cruel fate, Alyssa's schedule shifted, and she was assigned to a new primary location. She stood frozen on the sidewalk when she read the address on her dispatch slip. It was the exact luxury restaurant where she had sat across from my table and willingly poured synthetic neurotoxin into my tea. She pushed through the heavy service doors hours after the final patrons had departed, stepping into the cavernous, dimly lit dining room. The opulent surroundings viciously mocked her current reality. The massive crystal chandeliers hung silently above the expensive imported marble floors she was now contracted to scrub on her hands and knees. Every stroke of her coarse sponge against the polished stone served as a brutal, agonizing reminder of the empire she had so casually thrown away. She crawled across the exact perimeter where Wyatt had confidently outlined their hostile takeover. She emptied the wastebaskets near the private booths where she used to demand premium service from terrified waitstaff. The heavy scent of industrial bleach burned her lungs entirely, replacing the imported perfumes and expensive cuisine she once considered her absolute birthright. The restaurant was a pristine monument to her catastrophic failure. She was literally forced to clean the floor of the arena where she had lost her war. The physical exhaustion of the graveyard shift paled in comparison to the mental torture of occupying that specific space. She wiped down the mahogany tables, her tears mixing with the harsh cleaning solutions, recognizing that she was permanently exiled to the service entrances of the world she used to own. The grueling, monotonous routine fractured on a Tuesday evening when the restaurant closed its doors to the general public to host an exclusive invite-only VIP charity gala. The staffing supervisor ordered Alyssa and the cleaning crew to remain entirely out of sight, mandated to maintain the perimeter and polish the baseboards in the grand foyer while the city's elite arrived. The heavy mahogany double doors of the main entrance swung open continuously, allowing the crisp night air to sweep through the lobby. Alyssa knelt near the coat check, her knees aching against the hard marble, aggressively scrubbing a scuff mark from the polished wood trim. The bustling sound of expensive leather shoes and confident, authoritative voices echoed through the expansive foyer. She instinctively lowered her head, hiding her tired, unadorned face behind a curtain of unkempt hair. A sudden commanding shift in the atmospheric tension of the room forced her to look up. The arriving party was not simply wealthy patrons. I walked through the grand entrance, moving with the absolute, unquestioned authority of a man who owned the very ground he stepped on. I was flanked by the city's mayor, 2 prominent state senators, and the executive board members of my newly restructured philanthropic trust. The entire management staff of the restaurant rushed forward, bowing in sheer deference, desperate to accommodate the architect of the evening's primary funding. I moved seamlessly through the opulent space, discussing the allocation of millions of dollars in charitable grants, completely surrounded by an impenetrable fortress of power and respect. Alyssa was entirely trapped in the shadow of my arrival, forced to witness the staggering magnitude of the life she had been permanently severed from. Alyssa froze completely, her calloused fingers gripping a damp, filthy rag. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs, generating a frantic rhythm of sheer terror and desperate, misplaced hope. The powerful procession moved directly toward her position in the foyer. For a fleeting, pathetic second, the remnants of her shattered ego believed I would stop. She anticipated an acknowledgement, a stern reprimand, or even a brief glance of paternal pity. She braced herself for the impact of my anger, desperate for any shred of connection to validate her existence. I walked right past her. I did not slow my pace. I did not break my conversation with the state senator. My eyes swept across the grand foyer and passed directly over her face with the absolute chilling detachment of a man looking through a pane of dirty glass. There was no hatred, there was no anger, there was only a crushing, absolute indifference. I did not see a daughter, I did not see an enemy, I saw absolutely nothing. That profound, impenetrable void was the ultimate execution. The realization that I had entirely erased her from my emotional registry struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her absolute irrelevance was the final fatal strike to her soul. She was no longer worth my time, my resources, or even my contempt. The heavy wooden doors to the main ballroom closed smoothly behind my entourage, sealing me inside the warm, brilliant light of the gala, and leaving her trapped in the cold shadows of the foyer. Alyssa's hands began to shake uncontrollably. Her fingers went limp, allowing the dirty rag to slip from her grip and hit the marble floor with a wet slap. She collapsed against the mahogany baseboard, burying her face in her hands, and wept silently into the dark. The relentless freezing rain that had marked the final severance of my toxic past eventually gave way to the crisp, uncompromising clarity of a new spring. 6 months after the massive federal gavel struck down the architects of my attempted destruction, I stood on the immaculate, sun-drenched pavement of the city's revitalized industrial district. The morning sun cast a brilliant golden glow across the towering red brick facade of the newly constructed building rising powerfully before me. It was a structural masterpiece combining the raw industrial strength of exposed steel beams with the sleek modern elegance of tempered glass walls. Above the expansive main entrance, heavy bronze lettering caught the light, proudly spelling out the name that anchored my entire existence, the Naomi Center for Engineering and Trade. I stared at the name of my late wife, feeling a profound, resonating warmth radiate through my chest. This was the ultimate culmination of decades of silent sacrifice, grueling labor, and unyielding discipline. The massive commercial engineering firm I had built from the ground up had not been liquidated simply to sit stagnant in a sterile offshore account. It had been strategically dismantled and entirely repurposed to forge a fortress of opportunity. The grand opening ceremony was actively underway, the wide courtyard completely filled with vibrant energy, hopeful faces, and the unmistakable hum of legitimate, earned progress. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored suit, standing tall alongside Oliver and the dedicated board of directors who had executed my vision with flawless precision. The dark, suffocating shadows of greed and betrayal that had temporarily infected my life were entirely eradicated by the blinding light of this monumental achievement. I had successfully transformed a targeted assassination into an indestructible foundation for the future. The $80 million generated from the aggressive corporate buyout was never destined to finance depreciating luxury assets, imported sports cars, or sprawling penthouses built on fragile foundations of debt. Wyatt and Alyssa had operated under the fatal, arrogant assumption that generational wealth existed strictly to fund their insatiable parasitic appetites. They had completely misunderstood the fundamental architecture of my soul. Every single cent of that massive financial payout was irreversibly locked into a highly structured philanthropic trust dedicated exclusively to the empowerment of the next generation. The Naomi Center was meticulously designed to provide comprehensive full-ride scholarships and elite trade programs for hundreds of brilliant underprivileged black youths across the city. We were actively funding advanced robotics labs, architectural drafting studios, and hands-on mechanical engineering workshops. I was permanently bridging the gap between raw, untapped potential and legitimate high-paying industry careers. Young men and women who had been systematically overlooked by the traditional educational hierarchy were now walking through these glass doors with absolute financial security. We provided their tuition, their housing, their tools, and their dignity. I watched the first cohort of students mingling in the courtyard, their eyes alight with the fierce, hungry determination that I recognized from my own youth. They were not demanding unearned keys to luxury apartments. They were demanding the tools to build their own empires from scratch. The $80 million had become a living, breathing organism of progress. By completely severing the financial pipeline to my treacherous daughter and her cowardly husband, I had successfully redirected a river of capital to irrigate a barren landscape. I had stripped the wealth away from those who sought to destroy it and placed it directly into the calloused, capable hands of those who would multiply its value. The sharp, resonant feedback of a microphone drew the attention of the bustling crowd toward the elevated wooden stage erected in the center of the courtyard. The ambient chatter of the attendees immediately subsided into a respectful, expectant silence. A young man stepped confidently up to the podium, carefully adjusting his notes. It was Diego. 6 months prior, he had been a hard-working, invisible waiter at an exclusive fine dining restaurant, quietly executing his duties, while my daughter and her husband had treated him with casual, arrogant disdain. He had offered me genuine respect during a moment of profound family hostility, demonstrating a core character that wealth could never manufacture. Now he stood before the city's elite wearing a sharp, tailored suit, officially enrolled as a freshman engineering student studying entirely under the protective umbrella of my primary scholarship fund. Diego grasped the edges of the podium, his voice projecting it across the courtyard with absolute clarity and undeniable passion. He did not speak of statistics or corporate endowments. He spoke of survival resilience and the transformative power of genuine opportunity. He addressed the crowd, but his eyes locked directly onto mine. He recounted the grueling reality of working double shifts just to survive the crushing weight of deferred dreams and the sudden miraculous intervention that had fundamentally rewritten his future. He honored my unyielding commitment to the community, articulating how this center was actively breaking generational curses and forging a new paradigm of success. Diego declared that true power was not measured by the ability to tear others down, but by the strength required to pull others up. He stood as living, undeniable proof that an investment in human dignity yields the highest possible return, completely validating every agonizing decision I had made. The entire courtyard erupted into a deafening, thunderous wave of applause the moment Diego concluded his speech. City officials, community leaders, and the newly enrolled students rose to their feet, their cheers vibrating powerfully against the heavy brick walls of the Naomi Center. I stood amidst the overwhelming ovation, feeling a profound structural peace settle deeply into my bones. I tilted my head back, looking past the modern glass canopy and up into the vast, cloudless expanse of the clear blue sky. I knew Naomi was watching, and I knew she was exceptionally proud. The vicious parasitic demons of greed, entitlement, and fatal betrayal had been entirely and permanently excised from my existence. The surgical removal of my daughter and her husband had been a brutally painful operation, but it had saved the host. I had fiercely protected my soul against the corrosive rot of their deception. I had systematically hunted down their lies, dismantled their fraudulent empires, and forcefully restored absolute order to a chaotic reality. The legacy I had built was no longer a vulnerable target for cowardly predators waiting in the shadows. It was cast in iron, poured in concrete, and safely secured in the brilliant minds of the hundreds of students currently standing around me. Wyatt was locked away in a federal cage, and Alyssa was scrubbing floors in the dark, entirely consumed by the consequences of her own treachery. Their absolute ruin was the necessary price for this incredible creation. I lowered my gaze from the sky, looking out at the magnificent building and the thriving community it supported. The long, silent war was officially over. I had successfully survived the ambush, secured the future, and my new life had truly finally begun. True wealth is never measured by the balances sitting in offshore accounts or the square footage of an empty mansion. It is measured by the enduring impact you leave upon the world when you choose to transform personal agony into structural progress. Bloodlines do not guarantee loyalty, and shared genetics do not automatically earn respect. Real family is forged through shared values, mutual dignity, and unwavering integrity. When you ruthlessly cut the toxic branches from your life, you create the necessary space for profound, healthy growth. Protect your peace fiercely. Invest in human potential, and your legacy becomes totally immortal. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Anton's journey. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and the true meaning of legacy.